Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in to part 4 of episode 300 of Last Born in the Wilderness. I am your host, Patrick Farnsworth. As I mentioned in part 3, which dealt with specifically around the COVID-19 pandemic, that part, along with part 4, which of course you're just beginning to listen to right now, and then part 5, which is going to be dealing with the rise of fascism and the coup attempt on January 6th, that all three of these parts are really tightly connected, that they build on one another really closely compared to the other parts that I'm going to be releasing and have already released in this series. I felt like with discussing COVID specifically in the last part, I was really helping to set up some of the various threads that I've been following through the past year or so since this pandemic began and our reactions to it were really taking off. Whether that be, of course, the economic impacts, the sociological impacts, the ways in which people have reacted in all the ways that they have to the various forms of restrictions, and not just the restrictions, but the perception of restrictions that have come out of this pandemic. It really was a fertile ground for the spread of conspiracy theories, for really highlighting the precarities of the global capitalist system, the ways in which the conflict between various groups of people was really heightened during this time. So, of course, Trump was president. He was a major factor in all of this, but the way that he and his administration reacted to the pandemic really set the stage for so much that has happened over the past year. And of course, it's really hard to find a beginning to this because it wasn't just Trump. It wasn't just his administration. It's not like fascism was born out of his administration by him alone, or those that were in his cabinet, or those that were advising him. Or it wasn't really even just the Republican Party or any of these things. You know, these things have been in the United States for a long time. And that's also to say that in this part, we're going to be talking about the uprisings that arose in the United States after the murder of George Floyd. Everybody knows the story at this point, but just to say it very briefly, on May 25th of 2020, George Floyd was being detained after going into, I think, a convenience store in Minneapolis. He apparently was trying to pay for something with a counterfeit $20 bill. He was, and I say detained, but really what happened is he was executed. He was murdered on the street by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, as several other officers stood around and made sure that the crowd that had gathered to try to intervene in this execution, that this crowd could not intervene in it. The whole thing was filmed, or a good majority of this whole event was filmed. And when that was filmed, it showed every detail. I mean, there's numerous angles, but there was one angle in particular taken by an observer, someone who was a witness to this, who filmed it on their phone. And as soon as that video was put online, it went viral. And when I talked about the fertile grounds of the pandemic, I just want to be clear that, talking about beginnings of these things, I mean, we've had hundreds of years of this type of thing in the United States. Even before the United States was a country, we've had this type of dynamic between so-called white people and black people, those that had been enslaved and had brought to this continent to serve landowners and the slaveholders on this continent in order to basically build the economy that became the United States of America and so many other economies around the world. You could very easily make the argument that the prosperity and wealth of the United States was built on the backs of enslaved peoples and on the genocide of indigenous peoples. That is not a very difficult argument to make at all if you understand history. And that's going to be discussed a little bit in this part as well. But with the pandemic, because of the way that it shifted the grounds, so to speak, a lot of the issues that we have been dealing with over the years really was heightened. It really became very apparent to many, many people that we live in an increasingly unjust and unfair system and society, and that it has been this way for a long time. The pandemic just really heightened that awareness. It also heightened the reactivity of people on the far right, people who have been reactive to, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, to the civil rights movement, and so on. Those people really came out of the woodwork as well. And I think having someone like Donald Trump as president who was dog whistling to these people, who was really talking about them in more favorable terms, and how he was speaking about, for instance, people that were engaging in really reactive politics and behaviors, really laid the groundwork as well for this type of heightened tensions that emerged after these uprisings began. So after George Floyd was murdered and this video was spread around the country, we started seeing, first of all, in Minneapolis itself, riots and looting, and I think that lasted about 3 days. What was really significant at this time, actually, and this is another unprecedented thing that came out of this whole thing, was that people attacked the Minneapolis 3rd Precinct. That has never happened before. In fact, it was, for me personally, as someone who is for the abolition of the police and understands the police for being what they are, an instrument of white supremacy in this country and of protecting the interests of capital, to have them actually face that, to actually have that consequence to their actions finally, was really inspiring.
3301, do we have to evacuate right now?
We need to go. As of right now, we can leave southbound. We're going to lose that opportunity in about 30 seconds.
Go. You need to evacuate now. Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate.
Evacuate now, evacuate now.
Get a citywide tone right now in our loss of the 3rd Precinct.
Airing information citywide. The 3rd Precinct has been compromised. Time is 22:14.
I talked about the uprising so much last year, and I really felt that it deserved to have its own part in this long series that I'm producing, that I'm still calling episode 300 at this point. I interviewed numerous people about this, and it is so interwoven with the pandemic as well. So it was interesting for me to go through all of the interviews I've conducted over the past couple years, and especially the ones that I conducted since the pandemic began, and to try to organize them in a way that made sense to discuss each of these major themes with this series. I think it's really important that we understand how significant 2020 was, how so many things came to a head last year, including the fight for social justice, to address the hundreds of years of trauma, of systemic oppression that people of color, and particularly Black people, have experienced in this country. These uprisings were completely justified, and they should have maybe even have gone further. And that's actually a part of this as well, is one of the many threads that we're going to follow through this part is, one, the roots of this thing. Historically, we can understand how the pandemic itself produced the conditions for this thing to take off, in part. We can also talk about how this fits into the longer history of the United States and resistance movements and other uprisings that we've had in this country. We're also going to talk about how there is this process that occurs almost every time any radical uprising emerges, where you see nonprofits, you start to see the interests of capital, you start to see the Democratic Party establishment, and so on. They begin to really co-opt or attempt to co-opt the movement. They attempt to suck the life out of it and de-radicalize it and turn it into something that can be fit into someone's political campaign, something that can be bought and sold. Black Lives Matter becomes a hashtag on social media, and it's something that any corporation or any other nonprofit can easily co-opt and take for their own branding purposes, right? This is something that happens under capitalism, especially, and within a liberal, so-called liberal democracy that we live in today. They don't want the deeply radical elements of this movement to be at the forefront, even though that's how it started. This uprising, these series of uprisings, began with riots. They began with attacking a police precinct, and they tried very hard to get people to forget that. I know a lot of people haven't forgotten it, but they wanted to move the energy away from that radical core. For me personally, last year, one of the ways that I was able to make sense of all of this was to interview a broad array of individuals, people who I trusted, people who I knew had a finger on the pulse of this thing. With all that being said, I would like to move into the first part that I want to feature here, and that is with Silvia Federici. This is my second interview that I had conducted with Silvia. This was released in the summer of last year, in July. And just to give you a little background on Silvia, I don't know if she even needs an introduction. She's been such an influential theorist and writer, someone that I've greatly admired throughout doing this work since coming across her book, Caliban and the Witch. But Silvia Federici is a feminist writer, teacher, and militant. In 1972, she was the co-founder of the international feminist collective that launched the Wages for Housework campaign. She's written numerous books, including Witches, Witch Hunting and Women, Caliban and the Witch, Reenchanting the World, and Revolution at Point Zero. And she is a professor emerita of social sciences at Hofstra University in New York. A lot of this interview I did with her is focused around her book that was released around this time I released this episode, that book being Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism. A good amount of the interview, of course, focuses around that. There is a significant amount of it that talks about the pandemic and about the uprisings that we were witnessing. So I asked Silvia to talk about the role that pandemics have played in the restructuring of human societies. So pandemics create the grounds for radical changes, and she provides a real deep historical view of this because of her work with, of course, Caliban and the Witch and the numerous studies that she's done into the impact the witch hunts had in really giving birth to modern capitalism, and of course everything that came along with that, including the slave trade and colonialism. Epidemics, the spread of diseases, has been really instrumental in a lot of these dramatic, radical shifts that we have seen throughout human societies. They have been openings for radical change, both in positive and very negative ways as well. And I think that's what we were really feeling, especially last year. And it's happening still, but especially last year as this thing was really kicking off with the pandemic, with the uprisings, and the far-right reaction to it. We started to feel the pull of those contradictions really, really dramatically. And that's why I think a lot of us were feeling there was a lot of feeling in the air. It was very profound what we were all going through at that time. And I think human beings have gone through these experiences before. And that's what Silvia really points to in this, explaining how throughout history, epidemics themselves have laid the grounds for radical social change in all the various ways that manifests. I was thinking about this crisis with this pandemic and how it seems to be, as you said, laying bare capitalism.
Yes.
And I imagine that back in the medieval period when the bubonic plague, when the Black Plague was sweeping across Europe and into Asia, that it had a similar social, economic impact. If you could talk about that, maybe we could draw comparisons there, and maybe we can see some of the great things that came out of that, and also some of the obviously terrible things that emerged from that.
Right. Yeah. First of all, in general, there's in fact the whole story of epidemic. First of all, epidemic has very little to do with nature. They are always, human-made main phenomena, because epidemic has to do with circulation of goods, circulation of people, right? And the bubonic plague was brought into Europe from the Orient and circulated. With the circulation, people speak of the Crusades and one possible disseminator, right? And but it was terrible. It eliminated, more than 1/3 of the European population, and it created incredible commotion, and on two levels immediately, right? First of all, the fact that so many people died, and the fact that the people became inured to the question of death, and therefore more prone to take risks, feeling that their life was already in every moment in danger, and therefore, in a way, becoming less careful in terms of one's self-protection, and more ready to rebel, more ready to riot, more ready to protest. And on the other side, the fact that so many people died allowed for a breakdown of social discipline, allowed for a breakdown also of social states, right? The kind of economy that was concentrated on the man of, the economy, what some call the closed economy. There was, basically all through the Middle Ages, economic life is concentrated in the land of the feudal lords, and their servants, their serfs, including artisans and so forth. Well, with the high mortality, much of this land is now abandoned, and so the possibility of appropriating land, of moving from one estate to the end, which often was forbidden to the peasantry. You were bound to work on the land of your lord, on the land of your seigneur. People begin to move around. People begin to occupy lands, and so in the urban centers they were developing. In the 14th century, you see that the wages that people were gaining begins to rise. Right? There is, in fact, a moment that appears like the golden moment of the worker, because the scarcity of labor. These, of course, in other words, the diminishing of the population, the scarcity of labor, seems to give a power, or gives a power, to those who remain, to negotiate better terms, to impose certain conditions. On the other hand, immediately we have a reaction. We have a whole set of initiatives coming from the different municipal governments that are very repressive. And there is an attempt to impose new forms of servitude, right? There is an attempt to, in fact, limit the mobility. And, it's out of the, in a way, dislocation produced by the Black Death. The sum of the elements of a new forms of production also begin to take shape, right? And so this as far as the Black Death, but I want to look at more historically the question of epidemic, looking at historically through the history of capitalism into the present, and there's certain element that always stand out. For instance, every epidemics always become the excuse, right, for for new forms of persecution. And the epidemic bring out, the social injustices. In the 14th century, for instance, when you have epidemics of bubonic plague, they come accompanied with massacres of Jews, for instance. People who are accused of being those who spread, the contamination. Later on, in the 15th century, you have another big epidemic, syphilis, right? And it's very interesting. The first cases of syphilis appear in 1485 in Napoli, when you have the siege, or basically the occupation by French army of the town, and which is very devastating. And it is out of this occupation that you begin to have the first cases of syphilis. And it's very interesting, because the French begin to speak of syphilis as a Napolitan disease. The French call it the French disease. And later on, everybody in Europe calls it the American disease, the indigenous people disease, because they begin to say that actually it's those who are coming back, from the New World, while bringing it back. So they eventually is the Native Americans who get blamed for the syphilis,
Mm-hmm.
So this the political dimension, epidemics are always the product of human social economic life, and of inequalities, and injustices. And in addition, they become the source, right? They become a source for scapegoating, for targeting people who have to be repressed, who have to be marginalized. This seems to be like an element that accompanies the history of epidemic. And I want to add, coming to more recent time, that when we look at the globalization process that begins in the 1980s, from 1979 on, right? The process of a capitalist expansion and the introduction of this new politics of structural adjustment in large part of the former colonial world, which is really a policy of recolonization, right? We see that almost immediately, with this new policy that is built around austerity, is built around displacement, land privatization, creating miseries right and left. Immediately you have an explosion of epidemics, right? And look at the last 20 and 30 years. I mean, you can see there has been one epidemic after another. In Africa, meningitis, cholera, thousands and thousands of thousands have died, not just of Ebola. Ebola is the latest, but they've died of meningitis, of gastrointestinal problems, cholera, because the condition of everyday life have so deteriorated, and malnutrition has been rampant that makes you vulnerable. It becomes very difficult to have access to medicine, to clinics, and so forth. Latin America, dengue fever, Zika, the avian flu in China. So it's been a constant. It was an illusion that you could have epidemics circulating across the world. In a world where every form of economic life is circulating, is globalizing, and not expect that there'll be also this circulation of epidemic on a much, much broader scale, that we have seen, at least since the great influenza of 1919, which, by the way, was very clearly connected to 4 years of war. It's never talked about. The fact that behind, in the backyard of that great epidemics, there was all the suffering of 4 years of trenches and etc., of a great devastation of everyday life. So I think that we have to see epidemics, the production of disease and destruction of life, as an integral component of capitalist development. That you cannot have a capitalist development that, as they say in Latin America, they call it development, we call it violence, right? That in fact systematically, as Marx said, separates people from the conditions of their reproduction. That systematically impoverishes, immiserates, dislocates, destroys the natural condition of the environment without introducing, new forms of diseases. We know, for instance, that with the change of climate, animal forms that were, limited to certain geographical areas are now moving up, moving away, finding new localities where to thrive. And that, of course, in conditions where people have not developed immunity. So there's a whole system that is diseased. These epidemics are a symptom of a much broader disease that is affecting the whole system.
I think one question that comes up in you discussing that is, with the epidemic, or I don't know if you frame it as a pandemic, but an epidemic of the Black Plague in Europe during that period, we did, as you said, there were some very positive things that emerged out of that, but there was also this reaction from the ruling class to
Yes.
further subjugate people. They wanted to take away whatever freedoms or gains they had made during that time, where we started to see the rise of, we started to see the enclosure acts of the lands, of the commons, and we also saw the witch hunts, of course, which you have done extensive research into. So I maybe just want to point to that, where we have in this moment that we're in right now, this incredible opportunity to liberate ourselves, to ask better and
Yeah.
deeper questions. But we also should be very conscious that those that have the most wealth and power in this system are going to use whatever tools and means at their disposal to further subjugate, and maybe even come up with new forms of subjugation that we don't even know or recognize.
Yeah, I think this is very, very important. And I see, this last month as the Black Lives Matter, the great movement. I think we have seen the movement is so powerful. And in many ways, without precedent, the fact that you have a large participation is so inclusive, large participation also of white people, and all of a sudden, I say of a sudden, but the issues that only a year ago may seem far removed, abolition, dismantle the police, dismantle the prison system, then now they are on everybody's mouth. They are on everybody. In fact, they become immediately demands. And the fact that we are beginning, so many are acknowledging, how lethal to this day, this extremely, to this day, racist society. This has been, I think, one of the most powerful, I think for many, one of the most powerful moments in a long time. And I think we're all feeling that something is going to change. But we already see the beginning of a race war, from the president to all the white supremacists who are now coming in. And the people, all these nooses that are appearing, the people being hanged, clearly not suicide. These are very, very signals of a war that has always been there, but now it's coming out much more in the open. And I think, we have to be very vigilant and very prepared, because there is a section of the population in the United States, who has made his well-being, has made his wealth on stolen land, enslavement of people, and they will not, stop in front of anything, before they lose those privileges. And I'm confident that the majority of people are not there, and the majority of people, are in the end, our interest, it's really to create a non-racist world and put an end to the slavery that has never ended, has never really ended. It's gone to transformation, but it's never really, and that's why, for instance, the United States still has the death penalty, and still has a mass incarceration policy, which it replicates, is the latest replication, is the latest reenactment of slavery. You look at places like, Angola in Louisiana, that's a plantation, and in fact, it reproduces all the essential elements of the plantation. Mostly it's young Black men or Latinos, migrants, and they are cultivating crops, which are then sold for profit. And they are working in chains, overseen, by white guards on a horse with a rifle, and in an exact replica of what everyday life was at the time of the plantation. And this is really broad. And the death penalty, it's really there. It's the punishment from the slaves. The death penalty is really the support system of a slave society. And when you see the way it is administered, who gets the death penalty, you really see, what this country is about. So, I think we have to understand the depth of that. I think it's there. People know. I mean, clearly the Black community know what it is, and many people in the white, communities, I think, are beginning to understand. This is a moment of great mass education also for youth. It's been very powerful to see those thousands and thousands of people in the marches, very young, 17, 18, 20. I feel like, oh my God, I think there's been a sense that this is a turning point. And despite, so there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of strategizing, but this historical combination of, the shock created by the COVID-19 and the fact that dealing with the epidemic has led so many people to create mutual aid, activities, to come together, to realize that you cannot deal only with your life, but you have to deal with this issue collectively, and we have to create collective structures, so the whole new level of organizing has come into place in the last months. I know here in New York, there's a lot of things. There's a mutual aid movement. There's a beginning of popular assemblies, that have been inspired and have been, energized, by the need to respond to this epidemic. And then on that, in the wings of that, coming the protest, the question of police brutality, the two things have, in a sense, the continuum. People it's been a really educational moment, right? Because our mind was concentrated on all these people that are dying, but already seeing, Black people are really the ones who are most affected. And then comes, yet another murder, yet another assassination, and this brutal disregard of life. And the two together, I think, has been a very powerful moment. And now it's that energy, what kind of structures we need so that this moment carries on over time. So that this moment creates, in Reenchanting the World, I speak a lot about the fact that long-term struggle need a reproductive infrastructure, right? That the same way as reproducing the workforce as labor, as work needs an infrastructure. You need to organize reproduction in a particular way to ensure that everybody, so you also do reproduction in a certain way to ensure that certain struggles can carry on. And I think this has been a very, very, very important moment for that. It's been a very important moment because the COVID has created a state of emergency, saying to us, we cannot go on as usual. We cannot go on as usual. We have to find other ways, and ways that demand solidarity, that demand that we think not only at ourselves, but that we think of everybody as a collective body. And this, I think, it's also the element of connectivity, with the protests that are taking place, in response to do this constant, war that is waged directly on Black people, but in the end, on all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because in different ways, the brutality, in different ways, the devalorization of life and the devaluation of life, affects everybody.
So in that part, Sylvia was really able to dig into the deeper historical roots to present an understanding of how epidemics themselves create seismic shifts in the societies that they are coursing their way through. And a time of disruption, such as what we have been experiencing as of late, really highlights fundamental components of the cultures and the social relations that we engage in, that we are a part of. She provides something of a warning there. And this is going to be very important as we move through this part and as we move into part 5 as well. I want to also provide some more historical context into this subject, and for that I'm going to include my interview with Dr. Gerald Horne. This was also the second interview that I had conducted with Dr. Horne. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at Houston State University. He's the author of dozens of books, including The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. That was the book that he was publishing at the time of this interview. This interview was released in June, so as I wrote here, Dr. Horne examines the material conditions that have precipitated the uprisings across the United States the past week. In response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, his analysis includes how the novel coronavirus pandemic has led to the, quote, unmasking of capitalism, stemming from the U.S. government's lack of economic support for the majority of U.S. citizens in the wake of this unprecedented crisis, the far-right political and economic policies of the Trump administration, the hundreds of years of white supremacy and class conflict the United States has grappled with up to the present moment. Dr. Horne frames the wave of uprisings across the nation within a deeper and broader context of previous uprisings, such as the Watts riots of the 1960s in Los Angeles and the nationwide uprisings that occurred after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and points to the impacts the long 16th century has had in the formation of white supremacy as explored in his book. Okay, so that gives you a pretty good summary of what we talk about in this segment and in the broader interview itself, but I just really wanted to present this deeper historical analysis from Dr. Gerald Horne to compare the uprisings from 2020 to what we have seen in previous decades in the United States.
I want to shift to what's happening just right now. We've been seeing uprisings all around the United States with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and then just previous to that, there was that incident in New York in Central Park in which that individual...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I feel like there's been and then, of course, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, I believe it was, being killed by two white men. All these things have just cascaded and feels a lot like a domino effect right now. I want to fit that within your understanding of, you talk about COVID-19, about the pandemic and the U.S. response to that. How much of these uprisings are as a result, not only, of course, of the long history of white supremacy in the United States, but also how the United States, the government of the United States, has dealt with this pandemic? Has that laid the groundwork for this uprising, in your view?
Well, a number of commentators have juxtaposed Mr. Trump's reaction to our men entering the Capitol in Lansing, Michigan. And he suggested that Governor Whitmer negotiate with these men. He, of course, referred to some of them as good people, as opposed to the reaction to what he called thugs in the streets of Minneapolis when you had the protests at the White House, both last night and the day before. He talked about ominous weapons and vicious dogs. Mm-hmm. He was waiting to unleash against these protesters. And so if you have this sort of mindset emanating from the highest office in the land, well, it's not surprising that on the street level, there's street justice, if you like, executed against unsuspecting black men like George Floyd. I mean, the fish begins to rot from the head first, and obviously the fish in the Oval Office is rotting and emanating and giving off a hell of a stink. And so that's my short answer to your question.
Okay. And I guess I just want your thoughts on how these uprisings we're now seeing fit within the legacy of uprisings throughout U.S. history.
Yes.
I was thinking about, I had a friend that actually was really excited that I was interviewing you again, and he had read your book on the Watts riots in the 1960s. he wanted to point to that, and I wanted to point to that as well. So again, I guess the question is, how do these uprisings currently fit within a legacy of uprisings in the United States? And also, what do you, based on these previous examples of uprisings, what are some of the anticipated outcomes that we can maybe look towards with these uprisings today?
Well, one of the striking differences between Watts in 1965 and what's going on today is that what's going on today is more national, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and to that extent, it resembles more what happened on April 4th, April 5th, 1968, after the slaying of Martin Luther King, when there were revolts from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Secondly, I think there's a parallel between the so-called Rodney King Rebellion in Los Angeles in 1992 and what's going on today, because in the former, there was an attack on the police department, their headquarters. And in some senses, that's where it all began, that the first night of unrest. And here, you've had the White House being under siege. You've had the state capitol in Columbus, Ohio, the security being breached. You've had a torching of the police precinct in Minneapolis, closest to where George Floyd was killed. And I think that those attacks on state power are very significant and need to be pondered very carefully. Now, with regard to how this will eventuate, part of the problem is that in the 1960s, and particularly by the time of the Martin Luther King slaying, you had a Black Panther Party, a centralized, organized political formation with chapters from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But what happened, as you well know, is that it was bludgeoned into extinction. And that now has given rise to sort of decentralized, leaderless rebellions. I mean, Black Lives Matter, which you could see as an analog, is very decentralized. And I think it's a reaction to when you have this centralized organization, the government then goes after the leaders. Okay, so fine. So you had this adaptation. The problem is trying to effectuate change to influence the centralized entity that is the United States of America or the state government in St. Paul without having some sort of centralized formation of your own. And that does not necessarily bode well. However, on a more positive note, just like the 1960s, you have a lot of global publicity with regard to what's going on. I mean, I've done interviews in the last few days with Turkish media, Russian media. Tomorrow it's Iran. And I think that global publicity hopefully will be wind in the sails of the protesters today. But once again, it's going to be hard to take advantage of that without some sort of leadership. I mean, somebody sitting across the table with the representatives from Cuba at their embassy in Washington, for example. So it's going to be very difficult, but I'm hopeful.
Right. And I guess there has been these. I just want to get your insights into this. We have seen with a lot of these protests, of course, these uprisings, there has been what has been defined as looting, of course. And then there's another element to this that's been coming up more recently, which is this is hard to kind of suss out for myself. I'm seeing that it's kind of both, where you see the police, I think in Minneapolis or elsewhere, they've blamed outside agitators for what's happening in their city. And I feel like that's often used as a way to delegitimize the anger and the rage that we're seeing. But I also see that there is, in fact, legitimate claims now being made that white supremacists and other outside groups are coming into these protests, into these demonstrations, and causing mayhem, basically. And I just want to know how that fits, if there is any other corollaries or any other examples that we can look to in recent or maybe deeper into the United States history of outside agitators or white supremacists or other groups coming in to cause mayhem and delegitimize, in the public eye at least, delegitimize the aims of these uprisings and protests.
Well, I think you framed the issue nicely. That is to say that obviously this trope of outside agitator has been used to make illegitimate protests that have all the legitimacy in the world. I even saw or was made aware of a tweet who blamed a tweet post that blamed the protests on Russia. And that this is just another example of Moscow stirring up the Negroes, for example. And as you know, there's a long discredited history of anti-racist protests being seen as no more as being the pawns of Moscow. At the same time, we're also aware of a parallel and companion history of COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program of the FBI, that used dirty tricks to try to destabilize legitimate movements. And Michelle Goldberg, the columnist from the New York Times, in her column just a day or so ago, linked to a column that went into some detail about white supremacists coming into Minneapolis to try to stir up issues because they saw this as a way to promote what they called a, quote, race war, unquote. All this shows that, we're facing a very complicated political situation. And I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think it really does bespeak how, I know it's going to sound a little old fashioned, but pardon me, but, we need some leadership. I mean, we need some organization because all of the people who are trying to destabilize us are organized, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they have leaders. And like I said, I understand historically why there's been a movement away from that model. But I'm not sure if it's going to be sufficient to meet this current moment.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to pivot and see if there's any way we can segue into this gracefully. But I know you have a book that's coming out here within another month or two, based on what I've looked up anyway, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. I think it's important that, we're caught up in the momentum and the fluidity of the current uprisings to frame that. And I see this happening. I see some very eloquent speeches by some of the demonstrators and the activists involved in these uprisings, speaking to the history of white supremacy and genocide of indigenous peoples in what is now called the United States of America. I remember the last time we spoke, I believe you were briefly mentioning that you were digging into this long century, the long 16th century, as it said here in the subtitle of your book. You were doing research into that at the time. Again, I don't know how to gracefully segue into this, but I want to talk about what's happening now based on the research that you present in that book. If there was a connection there, what would that connection be?
Well, as the subtitle suggests, one of the themes of this new book is white supremacy. And I think that if you look at what unfolded in Minneapolis just a few days ago, you saw a naked and raw expression of white supremacy. I don't think we should see it as coincidental or accidental that this violence pornography that we keep getting subjected to on tape inevitably seems to involve Black men. It's part of the legacy of slavery, and the flip side of slavery was the construction of white supremacy. And what do I mean by white supremacy? In part, what I mean is a kind of solidarity in a pan-European project across class lines, involving class collaboration, if you like, between richer and poor Europeans as against the interests of those not allowed to enter the hallowed halls of whiteness, speaking of Native Americans, speaking of Africans. And when you saw this police officer killing on tape George Floyd, he was basically enacting and reenacting a longer drama whereby people not defined as white were being subjected to, shall we say, harsh measures in order to keep them in line so that they will be compliant and pliable and not willing to rebel against the status quo. And I think that the problem for the United States, this country that evolved out of this settler colonial project, is that when there was the revolt against British rule in the 1770s, it was a revolt led by slave owners, but many of the foot soldiers, of course, were not slave owners, but they hoped to aspire to be so. And certainly, from their point of view, they were benefiting from the largesse that was being created by the free labor of thousands of Africans. So it was sort of a class collaboration project from its inception, whereas the Africans were reluctant, shall we say, to collaborate with slave owners and slave masters. And their project was based upon class conflict and class struggle at root. But what happens is that in the 20th century, when the United States embarks upon the Cold War, it seeks to make illegitimate the very concept of class conflict and class struggle. And so therefore, what happens even today is that Black struggle is viewed solely and exclusively through a racial lens, which I understand, and certainly the racial lens can be useful. But what has been discarded is seeing this struggle through the lens of class, which then makes it difficult to understand that struggle, makes it difficult to understand class collaboration, and all of this tied up and bound up in the invasion of what the settlers call Virginia in 1607, which is, of course, the conclusion, as I tell the story, of the long 16th century, which begins in 1492 with Columbus crossing the ocean blue. And I should make another statement about this pan-European project, which is that, in a sense, it grows out of religion. That is to say, that England was the scrappy underdog in the 1500s because it had embraced the Protestant faith, which was a split away, as you know, from Roman Catholicism. There was good reason for King Henry VIII, besides the fact of wanting the divorce, to split from the Catholic Church because the Vatican basically had divided the world between and amongst the Iberians, the Portuguese and the Spanish. And so if he wanted in on the banquet of colonialism, he had to take another route. And so, fine, he liquidates the Catholic Church, appropriates their property, in fact, sends part of their property to his budding new ally, the Ottoman Turks, which helps to give rise to this idea of perfidious Albion, how these damn English Christians will even ally with the supposed foe that is Islam. But what that also means is that London has to pivot. And just as it had expelled its Jewish population in 1291, 2 centuries before the Spanish did in 1492, because it was a scrappy underdog and because it was under siege by the Catholic powers, it decides to open its arms and embrace the Jewish population, just like it had been warring against the Irish and the Scots for centuries. But yet, in terms of building its settler colonial project, is able to rebrand all of these so-called dissident populations as, quote, white, unquote, and they're allowed to share it in the colonial feast and the settler colonial feast and the feast that was enslavement of Africans. But what happens, of course, over the centuries is that this project is forced to retreat by the Haitian Revolution, which destabilizes the system of slavery hemispherically, and then leads directly to the U.S. Civil War, which leads to the abolition of slavery. And then, of course, the Jim Crow system that replaces slavery is forced to retreat because of the strength of national liberation movements and their allies in the socialist camp. And now here we are today, and the United States is faced with this new Cold War II with China. And yet, as noted, it has to borrow money from China to combat China, which is not a sustainable proposition.
All right, so Dr. Horne there was able to provide some more historical context about what was happening. And I recorded that. I mean, as you may have heard there, recorded that interview in early June. So a lot of these interviews were recorded right when the uprisings were just beginning and as they began to play out. And later on, you're going to hear more interviews as the months proceeded, as the uprisings transformed and changed, as different parts of the country became more confrontational with the police. There's going to be an interview about Portland coming up later. I guess to provide a little more context about what we were dealing with at that time, I would like to present my interview with Chris Hedges. This was also recorded around the same time that I interviewed Dr. Horne. When I was able to get Chris on the podcast, he had just published an article for SheerPost. The title of that was The Treason of the Ruling Class. And I do actually quote this in the interview itself. You're going to hear that here. I'll just quote the first paragraph. Quote, "In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience," Stokely Carmichael warned. "And if your opponent is bereft of a conscience, then state violence is inevitably met with counterviolence. Tyranny takes the place of reform. The danger of widespread sectarian violence in America is now very real," end quote. So he talks about this idea that the paths to reform in the United States are dead, or largely are dead. The Democratic Party isn't going to do shit to address these grievances. The Republican Party certainly isn't going to. They're going to deny that there's even a problem to begin with. And what inevitably happens when these more radical movements emerge to address systemic racism, white supremacy, police brutality, and so on in the United States is you have the Democratic Party establishment and other political groups attempts to co-opt and suck the energy out of the movement itself, to de-radicalize it, to decenter it from what it's actually trying to accomplish, tries to integrate it into establishment politics, which in turn neuters it, it takes it away from its actual purpose. And that is what was so significant in great part from these uprisings, is that for a long time, there were large segments of these uprisings, of these protests, that refused to be co-opted. And I think now that we're in the wake of these things, and by the way, I think we're still feeling a lot of this to the present. I mean, we're in the middle of 2021 now. The same thing with the pandemic, that it's not over. I think that the uprisings and their impact certainly hasn't left us. And like I may have stated already in previous parts or in this part itself, this whole series has been a way for me personally to go back and look at what was going on during this time and kind of process what actually occurred in 2020, how completely disruptive that year was, how it really forced the issues on so many different things. It forced the issue around capitalism, of its impact on our lives. It forced the issue of public health. It forced the issue of systemic racism, of police brutality. And also we were in the last year of the Trump presidency, which had its own profound effects on reactionary right-wing violence at a lot of these protests. We'll be getting into the white backlash in a later segment, but I just really wanted to feature Chris Hedges because Chris is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He was a foreign correspondent for 15 years for the New York Times, where he served as a Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief for that paper. He's going to talk a bit about his experiences covering the war that broke out in Eastern Europe and how violence itself, while he is not a proponent of violence, he understands its role in resistance. Yeah, I think that you mentioned how the Democratic Party, I'm curious about this. I mean, we're seeing mayors, we're seeing politicians doing what they always do, which is really trying to co-opt this movement. And I think that that's always been a tactic to try to draw energy away from it. Do you think, I mean, my sense is that
some of that is happening, but I feel that people that are out in the streets right now that are engaged in these protests and uprisings are not buying it anymore. They're not letting. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Whether
I don't think they are buying it. I mean, look, they tried to co-opt the Occupy movement. Suddenly, the Democratic Party starts talking about the 1%. This is a very different historical moment from the 1960s when, again, you had widespread popular protests, but the country shared its affluence enough that it could buy off white middle-class kids in particular, but also the Black elite. Now, there's such a concentration of wealth and social inequality is so pronounced. You have all these millennials out in the streets, and they have figured out already that there is no place for them. There's no, their future has been stolen from them, not only in terms of the refusal to address the climate emergency, but in the reconfiguration of the American economy into a world of masters and serfs. I think they saw, to the extent that those in the streets were involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign, how the Democratic Party, as they did in 2016, conspired, led by Barack Obama, to deny Sanders the nomination. So that's my sense, that there's a political maturity and sophistication out there. And I think we see evidence of that, in just the tangential activities, not just ripping down Confederate monuments, which is great, but also in terms of not buying, de Blasio is booed. They're just not buying the gaslighting that the Democratic elites, including people of color, are trying to peddle. And that's, for me, a really good sign. I think the elites haven't figured it out yet. I think they think they're going to use the familiar tactics that they've used in the past to, rhetorically address issues, cosmetically, banning chokeholds and stuff like this. But I mean, we go all the way back to Johnson. All the measures of police reform, as Naomi Mirakawa points out in her book, The First Civil Right, have only served to make the police more powerful and more omnipotent. And I think we have to look at it in economic terms, that the police are, and police terror is the right word. I teach in a prison. Most of my students are coerced. Coerced is the right word, into plea deals, often for crimes they didn't commit. That this is the last kind of bulwark of social control for people trapped in internal colonies where there's no work, cast aside by the state as, in the eyes of the state, kind of human refuse. And so serious police reform, defunding the police, is never going to happen in the hands of the ruling elites, because they are the instrument, along with mass incarceration. Because of course we have the world's largest prison population, 25% of the world's prison population, about 4% of the world's population. That's what they've done to deal with what Marx would call redundant or surplus labor. So the elites are in a kind of bind right now. And I think that what we're seeing in the streets is that people are talking about, real, genuine change. And so far the elites are using the old playbook, but I'm not sure it's going to work. I hope it doesn't work. Right. Yeah, me too. And you talk about this, how the elites just seem to not get it yet. And I'm sure there are many, many parallels throughout modern and just history in general. This sort of myopic view that they have. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Like, what exactly is it about living in a society where you are the elite that inevitably leads to that kind of myopic perspective, where
like the famous line from the Queen of France, let them eat cake. It's like that kind of blindness to what's actually happening, the social conditions that are
because
leading.
They don't live like the rest of us. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is one of the richest figures in the Congress. They don't fly commercial airlines. They only socialize and spend their time with the other oligarchs. They're just completely out of touch with the rest of the country. So that's why. I mean, it's their own version of Versailles or the Forbidden City. I saw it in Eastern Europe, the old communist parties in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, where I also worked as a reporter, Ceausescu in Romania. They create these kind of bubbles, which on the one hand, they have almost unchecked power. On the other hand, they're not anymore cognizant of what's happening in the world around them. And that's a very dangerous combination. That's what we're seeing.
In your article, The Treason of the Ruling Class, you write, in order for this is a quote from Stokely Carmichael, in order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. And then you say, and if your opponent is bereft of a conscience, then state violence is inevitably met with counter-violence. Tyranny takes the place of reform. The danger of widespread sectarian violence in America is now very real. There are three options. Reform, which, given the decay in the American body politic, is impossible. Revolution, or tyranny. The more things deteriorate, the more the elites feel threatened, the more brutal the police, the National Guard, and the organs of state security will become. The longer the serfs defy their masters, the more the populations in the jails and prisons, which are already the largest in the world, will swell. So you're basically saying that I know that you're a proponent of nonviolent resistance, and I'm well aware of this, but you are basically what I'm reading here in this article is that we are at the point where nonviolent resistance is not maybe going to even cut it. That the options for reform are not there anymore.
Well, internally, they're not there. That's right. They weren't there in East Germany either under the Stasi state, but there you had nonviolent protests that brought down the Stasi state. The problem is that if you shut the avenues for reform, which has happened in the United States, and you continue to carry out acts of indiscriminate violence, which the police are doing, essentially occupation forces in these cities, then inevitably you're going to see acts of counter-violence. I don't, to understand is not to condone. I don't think the state wants violence. They always want violence. And this is why they are peddling this ridiculous idea that somehow Antifa, Susan Rice is even peddling the idea that Putin's behind it. But Antifa, which on this kind of spectrum of international terrorist groups would rank alongside the Boy Scouts, it's a way for the ruling elites not to address their own complicity and culpability in the oligarchic, kind of corporate tyranny that's been cemented into place, which they, in both of the ruling parties have orchestrated going all the way back to Reagan and Clinton. So, you will see acts of violence. We already are seeing acts of violence or property destruction. These two lawyers in New York who threw a Molotov cocktail allegedly into a police car. But that's not going to work. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war. We were surrounded by the Serbs. We literally trench systems around the city. We were being pounded with 2,000 shells a day. These were big shells, 155 howitzers, 90 millimeter tank rounds, Katyusha rockets, constant sniper fire. By the time I got there in 95, 45 reporters had already been killed. Nobody sat around in those basements in the shelling talking about pacifism. We knew that if the Serbs broke through those trench systems that protected the city, a third of the city would be murdered and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. And that wasn't conjecture because we saw it in Vukovar and the Drina Valley. And so at that point, when you face literally self-annihilation, you pick up a weapon. It doesn't save you, by the way, from the poison of violence. And it's why it empowered the gangster class within the city, which had access to weapons and a penchant for violence. So that is always the danger with a myopic ruling elite. I also covered the war in El Salvador, and the war started when tens of thousands of peaceful protesters marched through the capital, San Salvador, and the police set up machine guns on the roofs of the city and opened fire on them. At that point, you couldn't protest. That started the insurgency. So that's just a reading of history. I hope we don't go that way. I mean, we're seeing these very disturbing incidents where these nativists and proto-fascists and Trump supporters are driving vehicles into crowds. I mean, and Trump, the more beleaguered he becomes, the more he will incite this kind of stuff. It can't work in the United States. I mean, just on logistical levels, we don't have access to the kind of weapons that the state has. In successful insurgencies like El Salvador, you need a neighboring state. They had Nicaragua, by which you can arm yourself with the same kind of firepower that the state has. This was how the Algerian independence movement was able to drive France out of Algeria, because they had Tunisia. So just on a practical level, it won't work. I would argue that successful revolution, Salvador was in essence a civil war. Algeria was throwing colonial occupiers out. But successful revolutions, you go back and look even at the Bolshevik Revolution, are inherently nonviolent. Lenin wrote about this. I mean, who had a heart of stone, and his own brother was executed for a failed assassination attempt against the Tsar. But he was very critical of the anarchist violence as a counterproductive to the revolutionary effort. And that's true. I mean, all of the theorists of revolution, Crane Brinton, Jeffrey Davies, and others, have pointed out the one salient imperative is that significant sections of the foot soldiers of the ruling elite defect, the police, the military, that will no longer defend the regime. This was what happened in the Russian Revolution when the Cossacks would no longer defend the Tsar. It's what happened in Iran when after the Shah fled, the head of the Iranian armed forces said they wouldn't use force to protect the regime. It's what happened in East Germany when the paratroopers were deployed to Leipzig and refused to fire on the crowd. Then it's over. So, but we are a heavily armed country. We have a penchant for violence. And I worry that as things devolve, we may inevitably see more violence, but that violence will not help us in terms of overthrowing the corporate state, because the state will use it, is already attempting to use it, much of it fictitious, to demonize the movement and to justify draconian forms of control. This is where you get people like Cotton and Trump and others demanding that active duty troops, 101st Airborne, be deployed on the streets of American cities.
Do you sense, I mean, I get this feeling like we are in an uprising, there are revolts, but I don't have this feeling that it's an actual revolutionary moment, as in there's a real, you talked about the things that led up to this, of course, with the pandemic, the economic crisis that we are in the midst of. And I think you mentioned Bernie Sanders and the failure of that campaign, and all of that. And then of course, the killing of George Floyd, setting this all off. Do you sense that Americans are going to have developed a sense of class consciousness that could eventually evolve into becoming some kind of multi-layered, intersectional revolutionary movement? Or do you think America is not going to do that at all?
We don't know. No one knows. I mean, I just read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and when everything broke out, all the Bolshevik leaders were caught by surprise. Everyone was caught by surprise. So that's usually how revolutions work. That was true in Eastern Europe. You start with small demands, and the very act of resistance gives people a sense of empowerment, and often explodes into a movement that goes far beyond the initial demands and calls for a restructuring of power. So it's possible, it's not inevitable, but it is possible. And I think class consciousness is in fact pretty widespread across the political spectrum. You see that in polls, people's attitude towards the big banks, towards the rich who don't pay taxes. That kind of crosses political lines. I mean, I'm a fierce critic of corporate capitalism, but no friend of the right wing or Trump. But I was, before the pandemic, I was coming back from Washington. I was standing in a line to get the train, and the woman in back of me tapped on my shoulder, and she said, I know who you are, and I admire everything you write. And by the way, I voted for Trump. So, the appeal of both Trump and Sanders was very similar in that they named the fleecing of the working class and the working poor by corporate power. Trump, of course, is a con artist and a demagogue, but they both spoke to a reality that cuts across political lines. So I would say at this point, the class consciousness is there. Whether they will that will be formulated into a coherent vision that can take the place of what we have. I mean, all of that's an unknown. No one knows. No one can tell you. In that sense, having covered revolutions and uprisings, they're mysterious entities that have a kind of life of their own, which no one can predict, even the purported leaders of those movements.
Mm. Yeah, that's sort of the mysterious thing about it is, and I think when this pandemic started, I think I talked about this with people I knew, was this sort of, it was more of a feeling than anything. It was like things are changing in a way, and in a way that's very rapid, that I don't think that we even could get a handle on it at the time. But several months passed, and that feeling hasn't dissipated. It seems to have only been amplified. And
well, that's what revolutions are. They're primarily driven by emotions, which correlates with my own experience. And also Trotsky writes the same thing. They're emotional events. And, often there's a kind of inchoate quality to it, in that people feel something but can't quite articulate it. But then as things evolve, they are able to articulate it. So I think it's all there. Where it goes, really, we don't know. I mean, there was a revolution in Russia in 1905 that didn't work. And so we don't know. I hope that, because it's the only hope we have, I hope people stay in the streets. I hope they call power to account. I hope they refuse to be gaslighted, as the Democratic Party establishment is attempting to do. And my sense is that they get it. I'm not out there in the streets. I'm actually spending every day writing a book about mass incarceration. I've taught in the prisons for the last decade. So, but that's my sense from a distance.
Okay. The last paragraph of your article, you say this: the longer the ruling elite refuse to address the root causes behind these protests, the more they loot the treasury to enrich themselves and their fellow oligarchs, the more they engage in futile and absurd efforts to deflect blame, the more unrest will spread. The last desperate resort by the oligarchs to save themselves will be to stoke the fires of racialized violence between disenfranchised whites and disenfranchised people of color. This, I fear, is the next chapter in the saga. I saw this tactic used to deadly effect in the former Yugoslavia. These are dark times. They are about to get darker.
Could you speak to that? The idea that, as you talked about with Yugoslavia, I'm sure there's other parallels that you could point to, but the stoking of racial divisions. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, we're already seeing it. I mean, this 75-year-old man in Buffalo who's knocked down by the police and sent to the hospital suddenly becomes an Antifa supporter. I mean,
Yeah.
You are seeing it in terms of the efforts to discredit and carry out character assassination against people who have been victims of police violence. That is as old as police violence, completely predictable. That George Floyd was a violent criminal. He did the same thing to Eric Garner. It's quite and the media provides an echo chamber for it. So as the elites become more cornered, they will use that traditional tool, which has always been at play within American society, to turn this into a kind of animus between disenfranchised whites and disenfranchised people of color. I think the difference perhaps is that there are a lot of white people, fortunately, who are part of this movement. And I find it interesting that the demands in terms of either disbanding or defunding the police really come out of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a kind of genuine quality to these demands out of oppressed communities. And I think it's significant that the white people who are involved in these protests have essentially accepted the Black leadership. I think all of that is really significant and gives to these protests a kind of authenticity and organic quality that perhaps past protests have not had. But that they'll play the racial card, that is certain. Especially as Trump becomes more and more marginalized. And I think we're already seeing signs of it.
I think what came out of these uprisings is it became increasingly clear to those that were participating in them that the state is not and would not and will not do what is required to deal with the central core issue that was being raised in these uprisings. And the central core point of these uprisings was to address the white supremacist roots of this country and how policing itself is instrumental in perpetuating violence against communities of color, of Black people, of indigenous people, of poor people. The police act as the foot soldiers of the white supremacist nation state that is the United States. And that ultimately cannot be fixed through reforms. That there can be promises made that as the movement was, at that time, there was an attempt to co-opt the movement, to de-radicalize it, to decenter it from its radical objectives, to make promises that were not going to be kept as always. The police will make promises. We're going to retrain our police officers. We're going to engage in sensitivity trainings. We're going to make sure everybody has a body camera. All of these promises that they've made in the past, and that hasn't fundamentally changed anything. Black people continue to be murdered in the streets by police officers for nothing. George Floyd was a flashpoint in that. That video of him being killed touched on something that has been replayed over and over and over again throughout the history of this country, even before this country came into existence, that we are a structurally racist society and that the police operate as foot soldiers to protect the white supremacist order. That was what was being addressed and confronted during these uprisings. And the next person that I would like to feature is going to address some of this. Mike Africa Jr. is a second-generation member of the MOVE organization. He is the son of Debbie Africa and Michael Africa Sr. of the MOVE 9, who were released from prison about 2 years ago after they were wrongfully convicted for the death of a Philadelphia police officer in 1978 during an armed confrontation between MOVE and the Philadelphia Police Department. In the broader interview, we talk about the philosophy and aims of the MOVE organization since its formation in the 1970s. the role that he and his parents have played in the organization up to the present day. From there, he provides a background to the most dramatic confrontations between the members of MOVE and the Philadelphia Police Department. In 1978, confrontations between MOVE and Philadelphia police officers, leading to the death of one officer, the brutal public police beating of Dilbert Africa, and the wrongful conviction of 9 members of MOVE, and the 1985 bombing of the MOVE headquarters on Osage Avenue, Philadelphia by the PPD, the fires of which killed 11 members of MOVE, including 5 children, and decimated 65 houses in that neighborhood. He also talks about the case of world-famous political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal, including how the police framed him in 1981 for the murder of a Philadelphia police officer, to which he is still serving time for. And then finally, I ask Mike to connect the decades-long struggle of MOVE and the Black Liberation Movement at large with the unprecedented uprisings currently being waged in dozens of cities around the United States and around the world since the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th. I ask him what, out of these uprisings, what people really needed to pay attention to and what they really needed to focus on. And it points to a lot of what I just said earlier about how we need to examine the core function of policing in the United States and not buy into the promises that they're making, that we actually pay attention to their actions and not their words. From where you're at right now, do you feel that that the goals are clear in the minds of those that are participating in these uprisings? Do you feel like that everybody's on the same page with, say, you and MOVE, or do you feel like MOVE has an obligation to kind of bring people up to speed, I guess you could say?
Every group and organization that's out there, they have their own agenda. They have their own interests. They have their own desires. But some of those align with the bigger picture that most of the people are out there for. Everybody that's out there is out there for justice. Some people want to see it when it comes to protection for Black people. Some people want to see it when it comes to the police being defunded. Some people see justice as eliminating the chokehold. Some people see justice as looting and rioting. Everybody has their own idea as to what justice or the reaction to injustice looks like to them. But what everybody is out there for is to take a stand against an oppressive system and fight back.
Okay, what would be the next steps that you would ask people to engage in if you were to speak directly to people that are activated, that are doing things right now? Where would you ask them to direct their attention, their focus in this fight?
Trying to control or direct the people is like trying to control a herd of wild buffalo. What you want to do is you want to get that herd to focus its power on the direction that you need it to go in. What I will say is you cannot stop the buffalo. You can only hope to get their attention enough so that, number one, you're not stampeded over, and number two, they don't run wild and out of control and unorganized. The goal for me would be to say every single person out there should keep one very important thing in mind. The system is going to try to give us things like removing a statue, or they're going to try to do things like pass a law to say no chokeholds, or they're going to say things like we're going to reprimand the police. And what I'm saying is this: apology without action is meaningless. I don't care how many statues they take down. If they're going to employ the same mentalities that the statues of the people represent, then they might as well leave the statues. If you're not going to stop the violence that's happening against Black people in this country, then what are you taking the statue down for? You know what I'm saying? Like, they took down the statue of Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia. And here in this city of Philadelphia, people rejoiced. But the people should not forget that Frank Rizzo, the man, was involved in over thousands of black men and women being arrested on trumped up charges. They are still in prison today, 30 and 40 years later. Mumia Abu-Jamal in particular had 15 of the 35 officers that was in his investigation. They were brought up on charges, fired, and did prison time for lying on about cases, for intimidating witnesses, for misconduct. You know, so the prosecutor, Joseph McGill, was disbarred for prosecutorial misconduct. And these are all people under Frank Rizzo. They were all part of his regime. He put them there. Those are the cops that flew that helicopter over our house and dropped the bomb and killed 11 people. So if people are going to get apologies from the system, the city, for those atrocities, what is the point of apologizing when those people, such as Mumia Abu-Jamal, is still in prison 38 years later? Mumia Abu-Jamal had been in prison for so long that when he went to prison, his oldest child was in grade school. And now his child is a grandparent. And it's all because of the regime of Frank Rizzo. So I would say to the protesters, stay focused on getting results. Apology without action is meaningless. If a police officer takes a knee, but doesn't take one of his constituents to prison for choking Eric Garner to death, for shooting Mike Brown to death, for strangling and breaking the back of Freddie Gray, for killing Sandra Bland, for allowing George Zimmerman to walk when he killed Trayvon Martin. If the police are not going to arrest those people, but they're going to take a knee and act as if the knee is good enough, that is absolutely ridiculous. You best believe that when the police are targeted and one of them is shot and killed, even just by accident, even if it was unintentional, even if it didn't happen at all by a person that wanted to kill him, they come out in force and in mass, and they come for blood. So I don't understand how it's right for the police to be violent, but for protesters, they say we have to be non-violent. When it comes to the police, they feel justified in attacking people, but when civilians do it, it's criminal, it's violent. So for the people out there, keep in mind, apology without action is meaningless.
I think what Mike points to there is very important. It's not about their words, it's about their actions. And so much of how the establishment, contemporary politics, the political system attempts to deal with uprisings like this is to make promises but not really follow through on them. We see this happen all the damn time with various issues. Put on performative displays of solidarity with protesters and those that are mourning, but they don't actually do anything. They don't actually address the core problem. And they won't. They never will. The police serve capital. The police serve the state. It is against their interest fundamentally to abolish the police, to actively do what is necessary to make this society better for everybody. Also, I'll just say that Mike, as he referenced there, he referenced his family, he referenced the MOVE organization, he referenced what happened to them in the 1970s and the 1980s. The police literally bombed their headquarters in Philadelphia, which was in a residential area of the city, burning down dozens of homes. And while that may be on the extreme end of police repression and police violence, that really speaks to how far the police will go in order to wage war against those that are seeking liberation. So in talking about the police specifically, I'm going to fast forward a little bit in time. We're going to go to September of 2020. Now, I had an interview I conducted with Shane Burley and Alexander Reed Ross. This section I'm going to be featuring in particular is Shane Burley talking about how at that point in September, Portland had experienced over 100 days of consistent protests. Shane, I featured him in the last section as well when we talked about COVID and the mutual aid networks that sprung up in response to COVID. A lot of the same people that were involved in these protests in Portland were also involved in mutual aid as COVID began to impact people's lives, as also the wildfires that had sprung up in Oregon around that time as well, impacting people that were evacuating and so on. A lot of the same networks were working to deal with all of these various crises. So I'm just going to read here what I wrote for this. With protests persisting over 100 days at this point, Portland has been a beacon of resistance to police brutality and repression, with anti-racist protesters contending with intermittent violent intimidation from far-right groups, as well as the recent intrusions from federal officers from various divisions of the Department of Homeland Security, loyal to President Trump. I asked Shane to explain the conditions journalists covering the protests are working under, highlighting numerous examples of press being actively targeted, arrested, and brutalized by police since protests began. You know, what we saw in Portland was one of these examples where it was obviously dealing with police brutality, it was dealing with Black Lives Matter as a movement, it was dealing with all of these different things, but it also highlighted the authoritarian response of the Trump administration. And this will fit into the next part, which is going to be talking about fascism, authoritarianism, the far-right movement in the United States, and what ultimately led up to January 6th with the Capitol siege. We started to see with these protests not only, of course, this enormous movement for social justice, but also a far-right reaction, also a very strong, overbearing, violent, extremely violent reaction from police, and as we saw in Portland, from federal officers that were from various divisions of the Department of Homeland Security. As Shane is going to talk about, he went in there as a journalist to document what was happening night after night. He talks about the ways that the police really did not differentiate or treat journalists any differently from protesters, that they were actually attacking journalists in many cases specifically. Really, this just reinforced the issues that were being raised in these protests about police brutality. It's like you point to how police are brutalizing people, they're murdering people, how militarized they've become over the decades and so on. By actually highlighting that, by going out in the streets and protesting and making that point explicitly, police then prove that point over and over again to be true, that they are brutal, that they will crack down on protesters with extreme violence. Focusing on Portland for a moment, it was in the national media. There was a lot of attention on it. There have been protests. Let me ask you this, Shane. How many consecutive days or weeks has there been protests in Portland?
It's actually say right now because the smoke from the forest fires shut down. I think it was only one night, so I think we'd be in like the 110 to 115 range minus one night, but their super is still going out. It's just a little bit smaller, and also a lot of those organizations that were involved in the protests are working on fire relief, mutual aid stuff.
Oh, right. That's important to note that you actually have these leftist organizers and people that were protesting. Now they've shifted to actually providing mutual aid in this sort of climate fueled catastrophe that's happening.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm reporting on this for Al Jazeera that a lot of these organizations that were involved in the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of them who because it was happening nightly, they were doing like these mutual aid things. They were bringing food or medical supplies or coordinating rides, things like that, are now shifting and doing that for evacuees or for affected indigenous areas and organizations, and just getting all kinds of these distro locations with resources to where people are at, where they're staying, where they're being housed outside of their towns and that kind of thing.
Right.
So that has shifted a little bit. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about the longest sustained protest in the country. It's the longest sustained protest that's a real actual protest every night in Oregon history. So, I mean, it's totally unprecedented.
Right. So there was a span of time where federal agents, people working for, this is what I actually wanted to ask, because I think this was sort of the thing when this started happening, we started seeing these, I mean, they looked like an occupying army. I mean, they were men with fatigues on. They looked like U.S. military. I mean, basically, and they were contending with the protesters in Portland for quite a while, and they seemed to be more aggressive, more violent, more direct. They were also using tactics that the police don't normally engage in, such as snatching people off the street in unmarked vans and kidnapping them. So there was a period of time where, these federal agents came in and people were like, where do they come from? Who are they? What agencies are they a part of? So if I could ask you, I think that would clear it up a bit. Like, where did these people come from, these agents, and why them specifically from those agencies?
Yeah. So I guess to back up a little bit, the protest started on May 29th, and there was really large demonstrations, hundreds and hundreds of people. There was looting and rioting, and they set fire to the Justice Center. And after that, it actually toned down quite a bit and got much larger. We got the thousands and tens of thousands of people in these really large mass demonstrations. And the police were incredibly heavy-handed. Ironically, they weren't heavy-handed during the riots. They were heavy-handed every time since then. And so we're talking about heavy deployment of CS gas, really heavy attacking of the press, both legacy reporters and people who are just starting to like that kind of thing. Like a lot of independent journalists are out there on things like Twitter and stuff documenting the protests and getting a lot of the footage that the major networks are airing. So they were basically really heavy-handed on them, on ACLU, Legal Observers, NLG, Legal Observers, that kind of thing. And so eventually there was a number of lawsuits because of the violence the police were doing. And so there was lawsuits around their use of CS gas, the way that they were attacking the press, and there was injunctions put in place, and things started to lighten up a little bit. And also the protests had kind of waned. It started to shrink a little bit. But that's about the point that Trump sent in federal officers. And that turned what was a dwindling protest into a crusade for the entire city. And the numbers just multiplied by dozens more, and hundreds of thousands of people started coming back out. That's where we saw these big images of the wall of moms, these women wearing yellow shirts and standing in a line literally in between the police and the rest of the demonstrators. Also, like the dad block coming out with leaf blowers, which have the dual effect of being very dadly and also blowing back tear gas.
Yeah.
And so it just amplified. It just grew and grew and grew. And, the federal officers, they're coming into fatigue. And it was a confederation of federal employees. And we're talking about Border Patrol. We're talking about basically a lot of different federal agencies basically sent together, working with the Portland police, and in conjunction to on an executive order from Trump to essentially protect federal monuments, I think is the language, but it's basically the federal building. Of course, then they're just running through the city and doing what they want, snatching people without charging them, using incredibly heavy impact munitions. And so what they're doing is people see tear gas being fired, but I don't think they realize that we're talking about dozens of tear gas canisters within seconds, clearing out city blocks, defoliating trees, people having menstrual responses to it. I mean, it's really people having seizures, people getting hit with these impact munitions. Like one young man, Donovan LaBella, had his skull cracked and has a traumatic brain injury. Lots of people very, very seriously hurt. And so eventually Democratic leadership, kind of the entire state, everyone hated this. Every politician, everybody. It was such a universally kind of denounced that it was probably the worst conceivable move on Trump's part, except then he started sending the federal officers to other cities. But essentially, they negotiated withdrawal at a certain point. And the way they did this was by saying essentially that they can use Portland police and Oregon State police in the same way that the federal officers were used. So it would be like everything was the same. And so, everyone kind of, brushed themselves off and applauded that the federal officers had leave, that the pressure had worked. But in the nights that followed, the Portland police were unbelievably brutal, just totally ruthless. They used less of the CS gas. The federal officers definitely blanketed things with munitions, but the Portland police had no problem chasing protesters down, beating them, screaming at them, using, insults. Like, it was very personal and hand to hand. And that's what it's been like in, the weeks that followed. And so we're talking about nightly protests come out. Some infraction, large or small, happens from the protesters, and the police use the most unbelievable levels of brutality, dragging people around, beating them on the ground. Videos come out every night, and every night that I'm there reporting on it, they're holding people on the ground and just punching them in the head. They're just hitting them with these police batons, breaking bones. They're slashing the tires of reporters' cars, chasing people through residential streets. It's really, really aggressive and really brutal. And as the time goes on, the police seem to be more angry. And it makes sense since there's, hundreds of people out every night telling them that they should leave their jobs and don't deserve to be there. And so that's sort of the stalemate we're at. And so just a few nights ago, really, night 100, I get to the East Precinct, which is where they had started moving to the satellite precincts around the city. And so they're having demonstrations in different parts of the city at different nights. And so they were marching to the East Precinct. I go to the East Precinct and get out to go cover the protests, and I'm already behind a wall of police that are running a giant wall of fire because the protesters are throwing petrol bombs, and then the police are firing back impact munitions. It's incredibly aggressive, and it's only escalated from the police response.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, I guess being a journalist covering this, I think that was one of the things that was shocking to people, is they were like seeing images of journalists getting arrested, getting hit with tear gas canisters, rubber bullets, and there's a sense that we live in a society where, this kind of thing can't happen or whatever. The press are treated differently, and they're allowed to observe and, take notes basically of what's going on. But it seems like there's actually an effort, not only by these federal, I saw with the federal agents that Trump sent in, but also just with the police forces in Portland, for instance. So what is it like? What is going on right now with the press and how the police and maybe the federal agencies are treating journalists that are covering this? And maybe I'll follow that up if you could also provide, what do you have to do as a journalist right now to prepare to go into these places where these protests are happening? What do you have to do to prepare physically, materially? What do you have to put on? What kind of helmets? What kind of goggles? I know you've been posting a lot about that, and you write about that in that article, Shane, but if you could talk about what it's like to go into those situations.
Sure. Yeah, I wear a full bulletproof vest. It's full Kevlar. I wear a AAA rated bulletproof combat helmet. It's like the one that it's the kind that an embedded war photographer or journalist might wear. I have a gas mask respirator and a ballistic rated goggles that can handle an impact munition. And also they're rated to block some tear gas. They won't block all of it. And I wear steel toe boots and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's every night, there's just no way around it at this point. On night 100, I was not able to grab my gas mask before I got out, and the police in the line to block my car. And yeah, the police forced us through a wall of tear gas. I collapsed and vomited. I had to be drug out by medics. Wow. So yeah, no, it's really bad. And the thing, so I think one of the things that's happening that I think is important is that the police have basically waged a war on journalism as such. So they have tried to get press to follow rules that press normally don't have to follow. They have to follow dispersal orders. Every night, the police order the protesters to disperse. The protesters do not disperse, and then police just run shot over them. But journalists are there on the sidelines, covering it and writing about it, taking photos, that kind of thing. They are trying to extend these orders to journalists, which totally blows any of the kind of journalistic privileges out of the water. They're not accepting journalists as such. And this is part of what right-wing media and stuff has done, is to create a sense of doubt that press are legitimate, whatever that kind of term means. A lot of people down there have press written on their stuff. They have press passes that are legitimate, often issued by unions or something. But a lot of them don't get paid for their work. They maybe have a blog or they're on Twitter, and they're doing real journalism. They're doing every night. They're documenting. They're getting photos. Their photos are going to be played in every network because those are the people who are there every night. They're inside the protests. And a lot of like the legacy reporters and staff, there's simply just not enough money and time to send them in every single night. And so what they've done is basically try and discredit these folks and say that they're actually political actors. A lot of them are politicized people, but they're still doing journalism, even if it's opinionated. And so there's been all these, there has been injunctions put into place to slow down their treatment of the press. And the police have fought them at every stupid turn and done everything they possibly could to undermine those decisions and to push back on them legally. So they've done everything they can in terms of their kind of press outlets and dealing with their press agent to undermine the notion that these are legitimate journalists. Instead, create the kind of sense that press are covert Antifa, that they're saying they're press for cynical reasons, and that they're trying to get in to have better access at hurting police or something like that. The other thing I want to say, though, is that like people focus on the press thing really big. And certainly if I show up my very legitimate press pass that I also wear, that's from my union and stuff, and tell them where I'm writing for, which I'm always like on contract, they don't give a shit. It doesn't matter. But this shouldn't happen to protesters either. It shouldn't happen to legal observers. Protesters should have the same right to go out there and express themselves as I have to be a reporter there. And so, I think the reason that it's important sometimes to talk about the press is that it is sort of a canary in the coal mine. It shows that their willingness of what they're going to do. If they do that to press, they're going to do even worse to protesters. And that's proven true. The other thing is that they've been treating legal observers, which are kind of nonpartisan folks, just making sure everything goes according to legalities, and they document and report stuff back for the ACLU or the National Lawyers Guild. They're treating them the same way. So any form of accountability is under attack at these protests.
Well, I wanted to circle back and ask, I think I kind of nestled it in that other question, but where do these federal agents come from? And I guess maybe the better question I could ask is not just what agencies they were a part of, but what does it mean? I mean, I think Trump specifically, as you may have mentioned already, Trump sent them in. And why do you think that he had them come in the first place? And then I would have, after Shane, if you could answer that, but if Alexander, if you had any thoughts on that as well after that. But Shane, why do you think that, first of all, what agencies were they a part of? And what function do they serve for Trump? What utility did they serve for him?
So, they were from a lot of different agencies. And Sasha has kind of talked about this too as well, including Border Patrol and ICE. And I think that's part of what helped kind of raise the specter of this is that, we come in the heels of very long anti-immigration and customs enforcement protests as well that happened a couple of years back. So we actually have kind of a long legacy of already dealing with federal officers in some capacity. And also, they're very, very unpopular here. So Trump essentially treated federal officers as his private mercenary army. He sent them in like a secret police to essentially wage a political war on enemy cities. So, he has this rhetorical device of calling what he calls democratic strongholds as unruly and out of control and something he has to intervene on. He used this as a proxy to essentially show people that he can intervene on them, use his sort of political muscle and federal weight to go in there and do what essentially his base wants him to do. The question was how long he was going to stay and how effective this was actually going to be to disrupt things and if that would result in enacting any kind of political goals for him. I think that war's still going. Right now he's talking about pulling federal funding from these anarchist strongholds, whatever that means, and setting unreasonable expectations for them to be or that kind of thing, which is going to have very real material effects on people. And people focus really heavily on the federal officers. And I think it's very visual to people. They're not from Portland. They're coming in. They're ordered in by the president, which everyone hates already. And so they're really easy to identify. But the reality is that the Portland police seem to work with them just fine. And the Portland police feel just as alien to a lot of the people in the city as the federal officers did. The federal officers came in and they fired a bunch of tear gas at people and hit them with batons. And then the Portland police, who are essentially the local police that had a theoretical accountability to the people, came in and fired tear gas at them and hit them with batons. And so I think one of the conversations that happened here was that there was a shift from this focus on the federal officers and what they meant, what they symbolized, to the fact that it actually wasn't just the federal officers. It was policing as such. It had no way to deal with the protests that had any kind of, that were effective on the one hand. They're not de-escalating, they're not ending the protest. And two, that was civilly acceptable in any way. Their only way of dealing with this was to hammer people as hard as possible. And that was true if it was federal officers, it was true if it was local officers, it was true if it was state officers, it was true if Trump ordered them in, it was true if Democrat Mayor Ted Wheeler ordered them in. The reality was that the institution of policing, just as the protester had said, has shown a certain amount of problem, and that has made the argument for them in a way, and that's helped to keep the protests going. That this police violence continues night after night, even if it's federal or if it's municipal, that helps to make the case that the issue is policing as such, and that's why the abolitionist case from the protesters is continuing night after night.
So I think that what Shane explained there, being somebody who was participating in the protests, who was observing them, documenting them, reporting on them as a journalist, the 100 days plus of protest that Portland experienced, the way that the Trump administration in particular dealt with it by sending in federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security as his sort of private army, quotations around private army, this was a really stark example of how intense these uprisings were in specific cities around the country. There were numerous flashpoints in these uprisings, Portland being one of them. The brutality of the police is what's important here. I think as people saw what was happening, more and more people were being drawn into these protests in order to say, hey, get the fuck out of our city. This was obviously directed towards federal agents that were coming from outside, but also the police acting as an occupying army in their own city. The brutality that Shane described there really just, again, furthers that point of what the protests were about, which is to highlight the white supremacist roots of policing, the brutality and oppression, and the tactics that police engage in, and how it's only gotten worse over the years. And so I would like to move into another part here, and this part is going to be with Shemon and Arturo. They are political activists and commentators. They have written numerous articles for Ill Will Editions. I really appreciate what Ill Will has done since I became aware of them. I think actually the first articles that I read out of that publication were from Shemon and Arturo. They had written several articles around this time analyzing the uprisings, the multiracial aspects of them as well, the multi-layered nature of what this struggle was about and had been about up to that point. So there were 3 articles in particular that I drew upon to have this interview with them, including theses on the George Floyd Rebellion, the rise of black counterinsurgency, and the return of John Brown, white race traitors in the 2020 uprisings. And what I wrote here was, since late May of this year, cities across the United States have been rocked by numerous riots and demonstrations in response to the highly publicized police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. What makes this national movement unique, particularly in comparison to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, is not only the scope of these uprisings, but also the mass participation of the white proletariat. While still remaining a black, indigenous, people of color movement, countless white people have engaged in militant anti-racism direct action in the streets, openly breaking with the social and institutional construct of whiteness that, quote, continues to be the glue that holds bourgeoisie society together in the U.S., end quote. Shemon and Arturo examine the conditions that have led to this historic moment of unrest in this country and draw on several historical comparisons of class solidarity that have extended across racial lines. We also address the black counterinsurgency that has emerged in the weeks and months since the initial uprisings in May, as addressed in Shemon's article, The Rise of Black Counterinsurgency. We discuss a lot of these themes in this segment that I'm going to be featuring. I want to actually quote a couple things here. There's actually 2 articles of theirs that I want to read from because I actually think that their analysis is really salient. It's very important. It's very relevant to this broader point that I'm trying to draw from this part of this series. So first I want to quote from The Return of John Brown, White Race Traitors in the 2020 Uprising. The question that has haunted the black liberation movement is that of the white proletariat. Will it join the revolutionary struggle, or will it defend class society? In Portland, white militants are fighting the state on a local and federal level. Black militants are taking notice, watching, seeing if these whites are serious. The historic question for revolution in the U.S. has always been, will white proletarians fight alongside black proletarians? Portland, Seattle, Minneapolis, Kenosha are answering that question in the affirmative. Majority white cities have witnessed the most militant rebellions of this cycle so far. How do we explain this? The answer is that these cities have the weakest black middle classes, weakest black NGOs, and the weakest black Democratic Party institutions relative to other cities like New York City, Atlanta, Chicago, Philadelphia, or Baltimore. In Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, and Kenosha, the black counterinsurgency has been sufficiently weak enough that all these cities have produced the high points of the movement. So that is a theme that we talk about here, the ways in which there has been a schism within the white population as far as supporting these protests or reacting against them. The ways that whiteness as the glue that holds people together, those that are white like myself, the glue that holds us together has been weakening. It's interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon. And that's one of the things that is really relevant and very important about these uprisings. While it's most definitely about addressing police brutality, about the oppression that people of color, black and indigenous people have experienced over the centuries, the fact is we have what has been called white race traitors, as Shemon and Arturo point to in that article. It's very significant. But I also just want to read another article that they had produced in June. This is called, as I mentioned earlier, Theses on the George Floyd Rebellion. Thesis 1. The George Floyd Rebellion was a black-led multiracial rebellion. This rebellion cannot be sociologically categorized as exclusively a black rebellion. Rebels from all racialized groups fought the police, looted, and burned property. This includes indigenous people, Latinx people, Asian people, and white people. Thesis 2. The uprising was not caused by outside agitators. Initial arrest data shows that most people were from the immediate areas of the rebellions. If there were people driving in from the suburbs, this only reveals the sprawling geography of the American metropolis. Thesis 3. While many activists and organizers participated, the reality is that this rebellion was not organized by the small revolutionary left, neither by the so-called progressive NGOs. The rebellion was informal and organic, originating directly from working-class black people's frustration with bourgeois society, particularly the police. Thesis 4. Not only was the police state caught off guard by the scope and intensity of the rebellion, but civil society also hesitated and wavered in the face of this popular revolt, which quickly spread to every corner of the country and left the police afraid and in disarray. Thesis 5. The police displayed many weaknesses during the rebellion. Up against a few hundred protesters, departments were easily overwhelmed and forced to concentrate their forces in particular hotspots. Once police arrived in one area of conflict, people would retreat and move on to another location to do more damage. Conventional warfare, with its emphasis on superior weaponry and technology, failed to counter a series of flexible, decentralized, rapid maneuvers focused on property destruction. Thesis 6. The militant phase of the rebellion was from May 26th to June 1st. After June 1st, the rebellion was not only repressed through military force, but also politically repressed. Aside from the police, military, and vigilante crackdown, the uprising was politically repressed by elements of the left, which reacted to the riots by blaming them on outside agitators. In some places, good protesters went so far as to detain bad protesters and hand them over to the police. Thesis 7. Black NGOs, including the Black Lives Matter Foundation, had no relationship to the militant phase of the rebellion. In fact, such organizations tended to play a reactionary role, often preventing riots, looting, and attacks on the police from spreading. Black NGOs were the spearhead of the forces dividing the movement into good and bad protesters. The social base of black NGOs is not the black proletariat, but the black middle class, and most importantly, a segment of the radicalizing white middle class. Thesis 8. This rebellion was about racist police violence and racial inequality, but it was also about class inequality, capitalism, COVID-19, Trump, and more. Thesis 9. This rebellion opens up a new phase in the history of Turtle Island. A new generation of people have experienced a powerful movement, and in the face of ongoing inequalities and crises, people are unlikely to sit back and accept them. The rebellion has produced a new political subjectivity, the George Floyd rebel, initiating a set of processes with many possible outcomes which will be determined by class struggles in the present. The American proletariat has finally emerged and entered history. Thesis 10. This rebellion is the tip of the spear in the struggle against the pandemic. The rebellion shows the world that revolutionary struggle can happen even during a pandemic. The pandemic is only going to worsen the living conditions of people around the world, and as a result, we can expect more rebellions across the planet. Thesis 11. The George Floyd rebellion has been put down for the time being. Many NGOs and middle-class people will make a buck off the brave efforts of the rebels who fought during that week. But these rebellions will return. They are part of the ongoing class struggles that have been happening in the United States and at a global level since the last global recession from 2008 to 2013. Now the world economy is once again in recession. Thesis 12. The ongoing daytime protests are a contradictory product of the rebellion, drawing in large crowds, more middle class and more white. This composition certainly helps to create a nonviolent and good protester-type atmosphere, but that is inseparable from the black leaders who advocate this type of politics. At the same time, the expansion of the daytime protests allow for greater participation, which is important. Thesis 13. The nighttime riots had a limit in the sense that they did not draw large sections of society into their activity. Riots, looting, and attacking the police are a young people's and poor people's activity. Many working people had sympathy with it, but stayed at home. This shows that riots by themselves are not enough. Thesis 14. Many important struggles have merged with this movement, including transit workers refusing to collaborate with the police. Still, it is unclear how this rebellion connects to the simmering workplace struggles, prison struggles, and housing struggles which are unfolding in the context of the pandemic. It seems there are historical and future connections to be made. To what extent were those involved in the prior workplace struggles involved in the riots? To what extent will the rioters go back to work and continue the struggle at work? Thesis 15. Unions often view police and prison guards as workers in need of protection instead of seeing them as armed thugs of the bourgeoisie that they are. Despite the long history of police being strikebreakers, much work remains to be done on the labor front when it comes to police and prison abolition. Without the transit workers, logistical workers, sanitation workers, medical workers, and others, the abolitionist struggle is doomed. Thesis 16. Considering the low unionization rates, many workplace struggles will be chaotic, explosive, and unmediated by unions or any other kind of official organization. Unions will come in and attempt to control them and co-opt them. Can the struggle in the workplace feed back into the struggles in the streets? If they do, we will enter a new phase of struggle. Thesis 17. In order to reconsolidate its power and prevent revolution, the bourgeoisie scrambles to grant reforms and concessions. Some police get fired and charged. The budgets of some police departments get cut. Some schools and universities cancel their contracts with police. Some racist statues are removed. Trump signs an executive order providing more resources for police accountability. The Minneapolis Police Council votes to disband its police department. This sequence follows a common pattern in capitalist history. The ruling class responds to revolutionary crises by reorganizing and restructuring itself in a way that allows it to stay in power. Thesis 18. What must be done through the self-activity of the proletariat, other elements of society are attempting to do through petitions, voting, legislation, and policy change. Reforms are a commendable goal in a racial capitalist system that clearly prioritizes policing over life. However, we must keep in mind that bourgeois society wants to keep this rebellion as narrow as possible, making it only about George Floyd, about slashing police budgets and redistributing the budget to other areas of society. But this rebellion is about something much more. It is about the deep injustice felt by a people which no amount of reform can extinguish. Thesis 19. Abolition entails the material destruction of the range of policing infrastructures built during the era of racial capitalism. Abolition occurred from May 26 to June 1st. As a result of widespread rioting, more has happened in a week to discredit and limit police power than has occurred in many decades of activism. Here we see the potential of abolition in its fullest sense, opening up a brief moment of solidarity between the different racialized fractions of the proletariat, causing a national crisis and cracking open the doors to a new world for a brief moment. Thesis 20. Not everything that took place during the uprising was empowering and liberating. The same problems that existed before continued during the rebellion: racism, transphobia, homophobia, competition for meager resources. All of that doesn't suddenly disappear in a rebellion. The crucial work of building a new world remains to be done. Thesis 21. We have yet to answer the full meaning of this rebellion. Is the content of Black Lives Matter only about those who are racialized as black, or does the black struggle take on a large content? Thesis 22. Comparisons of this rebellion to 1968 are wrong. This rebellion is different on many levels. It is black mayors and black police commissioners who govern in many cities. It was a multiracial proletariat which rebelled. Thesis 23. Can the black proletariat lead the other racialized fractions of the proletariat in the upcoming years? This is a question that goes back a century, with Du Bois, Haywood, James, Jones, and Hampton all trying to devise various coalitions with other fractions in this country or overseas in an attempt to defeat racial capitalism and empire. They all knew that the black proletariat could spark a broad rebellion, but could not defeat its enemies on its own. Thesis 24. The unification of the proletariat in a common struggle to eliminate capitalism is the only hope humanity has of saving itself and the earth. This counterpower is based on all people coming together to fight against racism, patriarchy, and everything that capitalism brings with it. Thesis 25. The desire for multiracial solidarity is always fraught, as the histories of racism have shown. The development of solidarity will be tense, difficult, and will depend on objective circumstances and strategic choices. Of greatest concern is that solidarity might come at the expense of black liberation. To prevent this, efforts must be made to respect and support autonomy of the black revolutionary struggle.
If you could both talk about how whiteness can be challenged, and how, in particular, these uprisings that we're seeing right now in the U.S. is maybe challenging some of our deeply held assumptions about what it is to be, white, and the alliances that supposedly white people are supposed to make amongst themselves. If either of you had any thoughts on that.
Oh, do we? You want to go first, Arturo?
No, I'll throw it to you since
Okay.
I talked last. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, to me, there's a lot of ways we can approach how whiteness can be challenged, but in the context of this rebellion, I think what we're trying to say is that whiteness is being challenged by actual fighting in the uprising or the riot or the looting or attacking, the carceral state. And those are the specific ways that whiteness, right? There's an infrastructure to whiteness that we can imagine right now. And right now, I think how we've tried to emphasize it is it's attacking that infrastructure that so-called white people and non-white people can participate in destroying, right? So instead of having people go to lectures on whiteness or sit down and write a list of their privileges on whiteness or how they need to donate $50 to the one black indigenous person of color friend that they have, right? That's becoming popular, like give a non-white person money or a black person money in the context of Black Lives Matter. I think what we're trying to say is, look, it's very clear right now how whiteness can be challenged. And if I think in my head, if I just summarize it in 3 words, it's attack, attack, attack. Attack the systems of oppression, because there's a real movement that's doing that, and that'll probably have. I think it'll have more of an impact than any Peggy McIntosh, Tim Weiss seminar, or, to be honest, at this moment, donating $50 to, people can do that. Friends should definitely help each other out. But as a political program right now, there's a real movement that I think we've called revolutionary abolition that is attacking whiteness. Sorry if that was a little repetitive, but I think there's subtly different angles to approaching how whiteness can be attacked. And I think in this moment, it's pretty concrete.
Right.
Which is amazing. That's great.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Whiteness, obviously, when we're talking about whiteness, the racial order that we live in. It's a system of social relations. It's obviously not some kind of a biology. It's also not some kind of essentialist understanding of whiteness. It is a phenomenon that is reproduced by the dominant social institutions of society, of capitalist society. So when we talk about attacking whiteness and overthrowing the racial order, which is a white-dominated racial order, we're talking about attacking the institutions that uphold and reproduce that racial order, which is the police system, the prison system, the immigration system, the border, the schooling system, the way that the labor market is racially segregated, and there's a hierarchy around race, with who gets certain kinds of jobs and who does certain kinds of jobs, and within workplaces, within the housing market, gentrification, and residential segregation. These are all the systems that we need to attack if we want to see a revolution in this country. So for us, it's about what is a revolutionary strategy for the United States, and attacking whiteness is this particular vulnerability that the American state and U.S. capitalism has, but it's also been, its strength. It's been the glue that holds American capitalism together. It's this cross-class alliance between the white working class and the bourgeoisie, which is mostly white, and the capitalist nation state.
Right.
So, and when we're talking about, also, it's not whiteness studies or this idea, that, like what we're talking about has nothing to do with like McIntyre or like Wise or unlearning whiteness through academia or through a fault, like developing some kind of like identity for yourself as an anti-racist, as a white ally.
Right.
Yeah. But, some people have like looked at what we're doing in terms of like whiteness studies, but I don't think what we're doing has anything to do with that. Like that's one reaction I've gotten from people that I've seen.
Yeah, the
because that we're
Go ahead, Arturo. Yeah.
No, I mean that we're trying to like center whiteness and kind of like reform whiteness or reorganize whiteness in a new way. Or I don't know.
Right. Well, do you think that much of that? I mean, this I just remember seeing, and actually maybe I should point it out to this way, and I'll try to frame it in this based on what you just said. But I want to point to the article that Shemon, you wrote, "The Rise of Black Counterinsurgency," and you point to the various easy answers that were trotted out, that were given as to why the Proletarian Rebellion, which included burning down police stations, destroying cop cars, and you also say attacked police, redistributed goods, and took revenge for the murder of countless black and non-black people by the police. That rebellion in particular happened between May 26th and June 1st of this year. And then after that, basically what was basically revolutionary abolitionism, or participants in that were revolutionary abolitionists, were somehow transformed into reformist abolitionists. This whole discussion around, no, we don't want to talk about abolishing the police. We're talking about reforming or defunding the police. I saw this go into effect very quickly after what was, essentially riots and looting and really radical actions that were being taken in the streets. I mean, a police precinct was burned down. I mean, how it just really was amazing to see how quickly this kind of almost PR branding campaign type thing just sprung on that and almost wanted everyone to forget what just happened a week before, right? So how does that happen? I mean, because we're talking about, when you talked about whiteness as being almost it's a subject around identity, if white people can just accept that they have privilege and that they're talk about white fragility and all of this. And I'm not saying there isn't value to discussing that. There is, but the discussion doesn't end there. And I think part of what makes your work, both of your work, so valuable is you're highlighting class warfare. You're highlighting how white proletarians have so much more in common with black proletarians and people of color that are proletarians versus the middle class or the upper class, regardless of racial lines. And this rebellion, these rebellions that we've been seeing, has really kind of highlighted that. So maybe to put it back to what I was saying about how this whole movement has been sort of rebranded and kind of transformed into a more of a reformist movement versus a revolutionary movement. I mean, what are both of your thoughts on how that happened? I can maybe point to Shemon first, because that was your article, and then we can have Arturo come in after that.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, when you look at the date of publication, it's July 30th for the rise of Black counterinsurgency, and at least in my head at that moment, I had not fully fleshed out the concept that that basically this was a summer of revolt. And talking with Arturo and stuff, we kind of came to the idea that actually there's been different phases of the insurgency or the revolt. And over time, what we saw, right, there was I think in the John Brown piece, we kind of say there have been 4 acts, with Kenosha being the last of the 4th act of the insurgency. And so, which isn't to say that there hasn't been a dramatic shift from revolutionary abolition to reformist abolitionism. It's just to say that the reformist abolition has not been able to completely stamp out the revolutionary abolitionism. It keeps emerging again and again, which is a monstrous threat for reformist abolitionism, because it's trying to have a dialogue with the system and languages that the bourgeois capitalist representative democracy can understand, which are of course about policy and dollars and defunding and all these kind of halfway measures that will never solve anything. And so that's one thing to note, that I think the revolutionary abolitionist current, as much effort as there's been put around the country to stamp it out, has not been completely stamped out. And to speak more concretely, I mean, right, we can focus on specific cities, right? I mean, I've been traveling to various cities across the country during this insurgency, and the pattern that we see, I think, can be described in a few ways. One is that, on the whole, many of the official BLM groups, which I would argue are part of the Black counterinsurgency, as shocking as that may sound to a lot of people, they just are not intellectually, politically, organizationally, I think even in a spirit sense, the spirit of revolt, are in sync with the processes of the riot and and fighting the police and all those type of things. And there's a lot of reasons, and I think we can trace some of it back to the beginning of the Ferguson uprisings and the explosion of basically NGOs. I mean, what happened to Black Lives Matter after Ferguson and Baltimore is it ended up in this dead end of NGOs, which all these foundations came within a couple years. And right in Chicago, there's 80 million NGOs. Some of them have very radical names like Asada's Daughters. I mean, wow. I mean, talk about a radical lineage. And so far, I actually don't know what Asada's Daughters has been doing that much in light of the rebellion, but it's where are they? This is, I mean, if you're going to invoke that name, this is the moment to come out particularly hard and speak forth of this massive uprising. So I think a huge, and right, and then there's a lot of, so there's the big picture, and then there's a lot of micro stuff that happens. Like when I was in Chicago, some of the NGOs, I was there the weekend of July 25th when there were solidarity demonstrations for Portland, and Portland was exploding. I mean, people were fighting the feds, the leaf blowers were out, all this kind of stuff was, I mean, I remember staying up till 4 in the morning, watching Portland on Twitter. And in Chicago, the groups there made no mention of Portland. We walked by several carceral infrastructures and did nothing in front of them. A wall of moms came out in Chicago. There was no connecting, let's turn this into a national issue. Sure, we don't need to center white women, potentially white suburban women as the center of the movement. I get it. But why not use them strategically to say something is growing, right? There's a new layer of people coming out called the Wall of Moms, first in Portland, now in Chicago. All of that was ignored. And the last thing I'll say is I remember after the crowd on July 25th in Chicago realized that there was not going to be any militant confrontation with the police, half the crowd went home. I was really confused for the first 2 minutes. Why are people just walking away? And the only reason I could explain it is people realized it was just going to be another bullshit march that was going to, run around the city for 3-4 hours. And once they realized that, they're like, look, we're not here to march anymore. And lots of people had goggles, gas masks, shields, and they went home. And I think that's kind of one of the concrete stories that I think is a broader pattern about how this counterinsurgency works.
All right, so I really just want to build on what Shemon talked about there. This has been a point that's been brought up numerous times throughout this part of this episode about the uprisings, about the counterinsurgency, about the ways in which various organizations attempt to co-opt and de-radicalize these movements, these uprisings. We saw it happen in numerous ways, numerous fashions throughout this thing. And I think what Shemon and what Arturo have been able to articulate, to define in their work, has been very helpful for me, at least, in understanding this phenomenon, along with other people that I've featured in this part as well. And one of the other people that really does a good job of talking about this is Vicky Osterweil. Vicky is the author of In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. This interview was definitely one of the more controversial interviews that I had released on the podcast. I think what you should do if you don't fully agree with her, and I say this for anyone that I've interviewed, anyone that I've featured in this fuller episode, think about what they're saying. You don't have to agree with every point that they're making. They may be overly simplistic. They might be generalizing in ways that you don't find helpful. And that's okay. And that's why I do what I do. I try to talk to a variety of people, present a variety of perspectives about events that are occurring or subjects that I find to be worth discussing, right? And that's how it works. I mean, we all have our blind spots. We all have things about our philosophies or our theories or our ways of perceiving and understanding the world that may not be fully accurate and may not even be fully helpful, but we can find things there that are relevant and important to the way that we want to approach, say, these uprisings, what we saw happen over the past year when these things kicked off in May. So again, Vicky is the author of In Defense of Looting, and in this episode we discussed the history of looting, the mass act of publicly and directly seizing goods, and the vital role this act of wealth distribution has played and continues to play in movements toward addressing injustices of and abolishing the state, white supremacy, and capitalism. In the fuller interview, I ask Vicky to dispense with each of these arguments that are made against looting and rioting. I'll just give you a list of some of these arguments that are commonly made against looting. The looters are outside agitators. They are destroying their own neighborhoods. They are not protesters and have nothing to do with the struggle. They are bad for media representation. They justify police repression and are consumeristic and are acting on false consciousness. I just really wanted to highlight a part of the conversation that we had where, and again, addressing what was addressed in the previous section with Shemon and Arturo, there was this effort to tone down the more radical elements of these uprisings, which included looting and rioting. And it needs to be stated again that in order to achieve true abolition, in order to achieve true liberation for all people from the constraints of capitalism, white supremacy, from patriarchy, and so on, there has to be this confrontation with the powers that be in some form or another. And it can happen in various ways. There's all kinds of tactics that can be engaged. I understand that this is a debate, but nonetheless, the things that produced the biggest results out of the uprisings were the riots. People may think that that's ridiculous, but there's a reason why the police officer Derek Chauvin was arrested and eventually, just a few months ago was found guilty on 3 counts. Derek Chauvin, the one that murdered George Floyd, the one that kicked off this whole thing. The reason why he was arrested and the other officers were also arrested, when typically that shit would never happen. They would never arrest a police officer. Police stick to their own. The justice system works to protect police officers regularly. The reason why they were able to get him thrown in jail and for him to be convicted on all these counts, and again, I just want to make a little caveat here. That's not actual justice in the deepest sense. It is cosmetic. It is the bare minimum, you could say. It had a cathartic effect, I think, when the guilty verdicts came in. But nonetheless, it doesn't actually address the deeper systemic issues. And that actually is the point here. When Derek Chauvin was found guilty on all those counts, that was a way for the state to say, hey, look, our system still works. We have a few bugs, but we can occasionally throw a police officer in prison when they overstep a certain threshold. But how many countless cases of police brutality do we have to have in which police beat the shit out of someone in the streets, kill people, particularly black people? How many times has that happened where nothing happens? So it's a systemic issue. Throwing one police officer in jail is not going to fix that. So I just wanted to make that point because in the years since these uprisings happened, since they began, we did see Derek Chauvin get pushed through the legal system, and he did face, the consequences as such. But this is just one example in which the system itself will make compromises, you could say, or understands that, okay, occasionally we have to throw one of our own in prison in order to keep the system going. But that never would have happened had there not been widespread unrest across the country, for there to be riots and looting and all of these things that we saw come out of the uprisings. That level of disruption produces results. Now, again, we should push it further because it is about actual abolition. It's not about reform. It's about abolishing these systems. It's about pushing it to the most logical conclusion, which is to build a better world. And we can't do that with these systems in place. It's just not possible. So anyway, I had to go on a little rant there just to bring everyone up to speed to the present as far as how some of these things have played out up to the present day. But with this section with Vicky, she's able to highlight the historical, economic, and social context that give rise to these arguments and why they ultimately failed to address the legitimate reasons why looting and rioting is an integral and necessary act of direct action and cannot and should not be separated from broader movements towards social justice and revolution. So I want to quote here from the introduction of the book, and she states, Homo sapiens are quite unlucky evolutionarily. In almost all mammals, pregnancy and birth are safe and simple processes. Gestating mothers basically never die in childbirth. Indeed, if there are insufficient resources or the gestator is unable to care for a baby at that moment for some reason, the fetus can easily be aborted. But in humans, birth is violent and dangerous, life-threatening to both gestator and fetus. With that understanding in mind, we can begin to analyze riots as births. Riots are violent, extreme, and femme as fuck. They rip, tear, burn, and destroy to give birth to a new world. They can emerge from rising tensions and lead to nothing, a miscarriage, or be the height and end point of a given movement. In most instances, however, they transform and build a nascent moment into a movement. Rioting, as the black trans woman of Stonewall showed us, is a form of queer birth.
But yeah, I mean, this book was written 5 years ago, largely in response to what I learned and what I was moved to think about and study by the rebels of Ferguson, who I think really reignited this flame that has been burning, sometimes underground, sometimes in great conflagrations across the settler colony from the first moment that Africans were kidnapped and brought across the Atlantic. And I think that the book feels very timely now, and it in fact got its publishing date even got pushed up during the riots. It was supposed to come out in October, but it also one thing that I think is very important about it is that it's a historical text that speaks to this long tradition of attacks on property as part of Black liberation, as part of the attempt to abolish whiteness, to abolish property, and to abolish the police, and the pre-police formations that exist, before the 19th century as well. And I think there's a way in which that argument was always going to be, I hoped, timely, precisely because we haven't yet overthrown this anti-Black society and this world, and in the face of mounting ecological and political and economic crises, we really need to be able to understand all of the tools available to us in movement. We need to be able to genuinely understand the movements in our past, to respect them and honor them, and give and see them in their fullness and their complexity. You talked about sort of the way that nonviolence gets talked about, and there's really three chapters. The core of this book, the center of this book, is about the 60s civil rights movement. one thing, for example, that maybe the most famous text out of the civil rights moment is Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And we think about the Birmingham movement as this victory of nonviolence, when in fact there was about 2 weeks of rioting, cop cars getting smashed up, teens throwing rocks, battling the police. The first urban riot of the period, arguably, is the end of the Birmingham campaign. And that's what ultimately forces Robert Kennedy and JFK's hand in drafting the Civil Rights Bill. So from the very start, there has been, from our very core understanding of that movement in the 60s, there's this confusion about the role of violence versus or not nonviolence, as I call it in the book, because I think nonviolence is an ideology that should be understood as such. It's not actually a description. It's not a successful description. It's just an ideology, which I can get into if you like. But anyway, so now I've lost my train of thought, of course. Perfect.
No, it's all good.
But yeah, I think in this moment, there's this incredible explosion of unrest, truly unprecedented. I just wrote a book about the size of these riots, and there's maybe 2 other moments in American history that can compare, maybe 3, arguably 3, that can compare to the size and scope of what we've just lived through. But despite the fact that started because of 3 days of rioting and looting in Minneapolis, and that from there, looting and rioting spread to basically every major city and dozens of minor cities in the country, still somehow people can say looting and rioting is bad for the movement. And to them, I say, what movement? Where did it come from? Like, I genuinely don't understand the way this ideology is so strong that people forget what happened weeks ago, 2 months ago. They say, we need to defend this movement from rioters and looters, and then, here, of course, I'm talking about people who are, who claim to be on the side of the movement, and many of whom believe they are. Obviously, fascists can fuck right off. Like, I don't give a shit about what Donald Trump says, except for how we can use it strategically. But like, these people say that, and in order to do that, they literally have to erase this really incredible immediate history, really, really recent. And I think it's very symptomatic. I think it's very telling. I think it's worth noticing that in this moment, so many people are saying looting and rioting isn't helpful, it's not productive, when we are in the midst of one of the largest uprisings in American history that was started with 3 days of rioting and looting. I think they're really telling on themselves. But that ideology is so widespread that it has some uptake anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating how I did notice when the rioting in Minneapolis began, I did notice that there were people that I knew, whether personally or just through my connections online and through this podcast, that normally weren't in favor of these tactics. I would say they would probably be arguing against them, or initially like, actually, yeah, that police precinct should have been burned down. That wasn't such a bad move. How many times do we have to see a black person get basically executed in the streets before something is done? We've been talking about this for years.
I don't know if you saw that poll going around that burning down the 3rd precinct was polling 10 points higher than Biden and 20 points higher than Trump. I don't know if you saw that.
I did see that.
Yeah.
That does say something, doesn't it?
There's one more point that I would like to make before we get to the conclusion of this part 4 of episode 300. And that is to discuss the reactionary white violence that came out of these uprisings. It was mentioned with the police, of course, that is a part of it. We saw all kinds of things come out of this, in which violent reactionaries would come out of the woodwork to intimidate protesters, to guard, these statues that were being torn down. All of this, right? We saw a lot of this. And so every time there's an uprising, whenever there's a riot, however justified it is, when you see black communities, communities of color, poor people, whoever, when they begin to, make their voices heard, as Martin Luther King said, a riot is the language of the unheard. In spite of the history that we should all be aware of, we have a supremely white supremacist country. We have racists and fascists among us. And that was something that really came up over the pandemic, that really came up during these uprisings, I started to see reactions from people that were close to me. I started to see reactions from people that I didn't know personally, but that I was aware of. And you really got to see and really get a real reading of people's actual feelings about things and what makes them uncomfortable and how they react in the face of discomfort. And especially with a lot of white people in this country, it was a very visceral reaction that could be very much felt in really profound and disturbing ways. So that's the threat here. I mean, when you resist and you speak up and you riot against or you organize against the white supremacist society, you are dealing with a white supremacist society. And white supremacy is built on violence. It is built on genocide. It is built on the enslavement of people. It is built on exploitation of vast groups of people over generations. When you disturb that, when you shake people's sense of privilege, of what they feel that they're entitled to, there is a reaction to that. It comes in various forms. It comes out in subtle ways. It comes out in not so subtle ways. And we're definitely seeing a lot of not so subtle reactions coming out of these protests since they emerged last year. And one of the reactions came from the highest office in the land, and that was from Donald Trump. Donald Trump was dog whistling to a lot of people, to a lot of these white supremacist groups, to particularly just regular white people in this country that hold deeply racist sentiments, whether they're fully conscious of it or not. In order to talk about this phenomenon of reactionary right-wing violence that really kicked up during these uprisings, I spoke with Arun Gupta. Arun is an activist and he's a journalist. He had a few articles that were published addressing the rise of right-wing violence by counter-protesters and agitators at dozens of Black Lives Matter protests over the past several weeks, of course in June. In particular, we discussed what he addressed in his piece, Trump supporters are attacking and killing Black Lives Matter protesters and getting away with it. And in that article, he states, since the killing of George Floyd sparked unprecedented protests against systemic racism, at least 4 Trump supporters, including some involved in his 2016 campaign, have attacked Black Lives Matter protesters with weapons, leading to at least 1 death. Disturbingly, perpetrators have been released or given light charges despite severely wounding and killing protesters. The real number of attacks by Trump supporters may be substantially higher, as there have been hundreds of attacks, terrorist plots, and threats of violence by far-right forces against anti-racist protesters. Trump has encouraged the violence as well, fitting with his role as the stochastic terrorist-in-chief for the last 4 years. These attacks are unlikely to be the last by Trump supporters against those protesting for racial justice. So that is really just a really important component of these uprisings, how the history of this country lives with us today. And it is actually a very privileged position to be in to think that we have somehow moved past all of these crimes. We absolutely haven't. These protests, these uprisings were in direct response to that as a way to address those things that have long been neglected, that have long been ignored, that have long been repressed violently. And what we saw with this white reactionary violence that sprung up at this time was really a testament of how deeply racist this country is, how it is systemically, it is so deep, it is in the core of it. I think that the United States is irredeemable. Its core was built on such a deep trauma and violence against so many different groups of people that there's no way that you can reform that. This part also with Arun, really, I think you should keep this in mind about this reactionary right-wing violence as we move into part 5, which deals with the rise of fascism in the United States.
The thing we have to understand about Trump is he's both just a complete drooling moron, and he's also this phenomenal genius, right? The guy has no book learning, he has no erudition, but he is absolutely remarkable at manipulating the media, manipulating people's emotions, at spinning hate into political gold. He's really one of the most successful demagogues in world history. So it's fun to make fun of him, but if you just make fun of him, you're really missing what's going on in terms of how successful he's been. Because look at this moment we're in. You have basically the Great Depression, the pandemic of 1919, the violent white backlash, and that's something we should talk about. Every time there's a black political or social upsurge, there's always a violent white backlash to it, and that's what we're seeing now with all these militias coming out, or or places like Philadelphia, South Philly, where you have these like just mobs of Goombas, with baseball bats and iron rods, attacking people, while meanwhile the cops are like, oh, I don't see anything here, because they're basically the same racist fucks. They're interchangeable,
Yeah.
But this whole history that we see is going on, Trump is very extraordinarily good at manipulating it, and he's, as like I heard someone else say, he's a viciously talented psychological terrorist. So it's just like, he knows how to hone in completely on people's weak spots and then ruthlessly exploit it. So in a lot of ways, I think he's too stupid to know that he's a fascist, that he's essentially an American Nazi. But then again, so are many Americans. And this is the thing that my conclusion about fascism is that in a lot of ways, it's very much a corporeal ideology. It's an ideology of the body. And, you see it with Trump, he uses disgust often, right? Especially with women, it's just like Hillary Clinton is disgusting. Who's that? The Fox News host, she had blood coming out of her wherever. It's like disgusting, disgusting, disgusting. But the wall is beautiful. The tests are beautiful. So it's this kind of like dichotomy, and it also goes from the individual to the body politic, right? So if he has this personal disgust, against these women, and then there's also disgust against these entire groups who are polluting our body, right? Just in the same way that the women are polluting his presence, right, with their bodily fluids, right? So the Mexicans are drug dealers, rapists, and murderers, right? They're poisoning. These are words that he uses. They're poisoning our youth. Right. They're in the Tulsa rally, he talked about like some, like very tough hombre is like breaking into a woman's window, at night while her husband, who's a traveling salesman, is away. And it's just like, I don't think there are many traveling salesmen left in the day of the internet, and especially with a pandemic, but it's all about this idea that the other is this disease that is like infecting us and weakening us. Muslims are fifth columnists, and this is why we have to keep them out. This is why we need walls and barriers and militarized border. And it's all about this projection of strength and this masculinized violent energy. And so this is why I think, and because I grew up with a lot of, I call them little Eichmanns, who many of whom I'm still in touch with in the Maryland area, who are now all Trump supporters. And they're too stupid to know that they're Nazis, but they're Nazis. They fall for all this crap. They're anti-immigrant. There's Islamophobes. They go for these like totally like violent reactionary roles, traditional roles in terms of gender or race. They have this groupthink, cultish mentality. They want to like, it's as both like looking back to this idealized notion of the past that never existed and wanting to remake the future, right? It's a movement in two directions, and it is very fascistic in its content, and so Trump is someone who I don't think like could articulate the ideology behind, but I think we have to take seriously the idea that there's something about fascism that sits very well with kind of the way human nature exists in a capitalist society. And that's a very important qualification. I don't want to say that this is like intrinsic to human nature, but I think it is something that is intrinsic to humans under capitalism.
Okay. Well, I wanted to point to this this idea that you said earlier of the white backlash. So, you talked about Tulsa, you talked about the bombing. There's a massacre of about 300 African Americans in, I think, 1921, I believe it was. So about you said 99 years ago, which isn't that long ago, by the way. There's still people alive that were there when that happened.
No, of course not. I've been like going through some of my family history, and my dad grew up with his grandfather, and his grandfather was born before the American Civil War, right? I once interviewed this park ranger. I think her name's Betty Soskin, and she's the oldest park ranger. I think she's still alive. She'd be in the mid-90s by now. And she grew up with her great-grandmother who lived to nearly 100. And so she was, Betty was in her 20s when her, it might have even just been her grandmother, when her grandmother died. And her grandmother, so I'm talking to this woman, right, well into the 21st century, who grew up with a grandmother who wasn't just a slave, she was born in 1821.
Oh my God.
So she was in her 40s before the Emancipation Proclamation. And so it's just like, when you start to think about how this is very recent history in a lot of ways. And the thing is also, it's just like we still have not come to grips with like how many pogroms that there have been. And this is something that I've been trying to track. Like some of the ones are better known, right? You have, first of all, there's the Red Summer, right? 1919. And, I've always thought that's funny because it's also when you have the Palmer raids going on and, the basically the real harsh repression against the Wobblies and the deportation of thousands of people. But the Red Summer refers to the blood running red. And we still don't have a good accounting of all these different massacres. In East St. Louis, it's estimated that hundreds died. In Chicago, maybe 100 to 200 died. In Nashville, something like 40 to 50. You have Rosewood. There's this massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, where like 237 people died. These are all around the same time, And we also don't know how many other ones are hidden, but we do know, thanks to the work of this one scholar, James Lowen, who wrote this book called Sundown Towns, about the ethnic cleansing, right? There's the history of the U.S.'s ethnic cleansing is basically, genocide on ethnic cleansing on genocide, right? First, we clear out the Native Americans, and then you have slavery, which is really just genocidal in dimension. It wasn't the end, obviously, but the scope and scale of it is, a huge number of Africans, probably tens of millions, end up dying during the 2 centuries or so of the Atlantic slave trade and the brutal plantation systems. In Haiti, the average life expectancy of a slave, I think, was less than 2 years because the conditions were so harsh. But then after the Civil War, and the failure of Reconstruction, and the imposition of Jim Crow, you have sundown towns. And what James Lowen, he starts out by saying, like, when I started my research, I expected to find like, a few dozen, maybe 50 to 100 of these sundown towns across the country. And he says in Illinois alone, he found 1,000. And sundown towns it's apocryphal or real. I talked to people who claim that they grew up in towns that would have these signs, which would be like N-word, don't essentially don't let your ass be in this town after sundown, right? So this is where sundown towns come from. That that African Americans, as well as, when you go out west, Asian Americans and Native Americans and Chicanos were brutally ethnically cleansed. And this is actually the creation of the suburbs, are as sundown towns. And yet we don't know any of this history. And I studied history at a master's level, and I was never taught any of this history. And as a journalist, it's only been the last really 10, 15 years where I've been able to start to like piece together bits and pieces of this. And so I think it's just like absolutely important that, we have to understand this, because if we don't, we can't understand just the full gravity and obscenity of what Trump was trying to do with that Tulsa rally. And, what's interesting is there's stories that came out that claim that like no one in his administration knew what Juneteenth was. And they had to have like a black Secret Service agent explain it to them. And it's just like, I could kind of believe that, because the prerequisite to racism is to be an ignoramus. Racists are really just fundamentally, profoundly ignorant people. So the fact that, no one in this white nationalist house knew what Juneteenth was is not surprising at all.
Okay. I just want to make a comment here, which is, there's that TV show that was on HBO, Watchmen, right? Based on the graphic novel or something. And what I thought was,
I didn't watch that because like I read the graphic novel and it's just so reactionary, but I understand the series is very different.
Right. Well, I just wanted to say one thing, which is the show begins in Tulsa, 1921, when the Black Wall Street was being destroyed. And I remember when that came out, because I'm watching it currently, and I'm just saying this, but like people were watching that show, mainstream America, whatever, and they were like, what the fuck is this? They had no idea. They had no idea that this ever happened, that there was anything like this that ever occurred. So when you were talking about all these examples of pogroms, ethnic cleansing that occurred all throughout the United States over however long a period since its inception, of course, with the genocide of indigenous peoples, but more recently, just in the last century. And people just have no idea. There are people living in, like you mentioned, suburbs that were there because of what you mentioned there with the ethnic cleansings and the pogroms, but there's probably people living in suburbs that have no idea where they're actually standing. And it just speaks to the profound ignorance that we are like, we wake up in this moment in history and we have no idea how we got here. We have no idea what we're standing on, what came before us. And we have people that are living literally right next door to us or right next to us that are bearing the weight of a history that we just can't even see, and so when these uprisings occurred, I mean, of course, there's this sort of context of,
and they may not even be quite aware of it themselves, right? Because we have such an atrocious educational system. It's important to recognize that. That it's let me give you just one quick example. There were these sociologists, I believe, they did this survey asking Americans, like, how many Americans did they think died in the Vietnam War, and how many Vietnamese died. And what they found is that the average response was actually quite accurate. It was people thought about 50,000 Americans died, whereas it was 58,000. And they said 100,000 Vietnamese died, right? And the real number, just in Vietnam, we're not talking about all of Indochina, right? Cambodia, Laos, is 2 to 3 million, right?
Oh, man.
So they're off by a factor of like 20 to 30. And so they then like go on to talk about what would we say if Germans, your average German, thought like 300,000 people died in the Holocaust, right? In the Jewish Holocaust. What would we think? What would that say about Germany as a society in terms of like their ideology, their educational system? And I saw the exact same thing during the Iraq War, where this TV, is one of the big three, like ABC, CBS, I did interviews with people on the street asking them how many Americans had died and how many Iraqis they think they had died. And the number they gave for the Americans was pretty accurate. It was like 4,000 or 5,000, and then or it was like 4,000, and then for the Iraqis they were like 8,000 or 9,000 was basically the median answer. And this was after the second Lancet study, and I interviewed the authors of the Lancet study. This was a gold standard in terms of, because the first one was criticized, so they got even the first one was fine. It's done by this group of researchers who had been doing these excess death studies and conflicts for many years, right? But it got viciously attacked because they're talking about how many the Bush administration had killed. The second Lancet study, basically only about 3 years into the war, showed 651,000 excess deaths by that point. And this is after the second Lancet study. And it's just like, and so they were off by a factor of nearly 100, right? So what does that say? Because it's not just saying something about the average American, it says something about the entire society. It's about the media, about our political system, about our educational system. So the fact that people do not know, right? And like we were saying, it's just like, okay, maybe now they know a little more about Tulsa, but they still don't know really the extent, and that this was in every single way a pogrom because the state was completely complicit, and there was no one was ever prosecuted, right? And the state participated in this, and you have all these pogroms, right? You have all these pogroms against Chinese Americans in the late 19th century. The Texas Rangers were essentially founded as a death squad. And they committed all these massacres, and yet they're completely lionized in the media. This is one of the things. Like, I'm a little bit of a Star Trek fan, so I watched like the new Picard series, which wasn't bad. And what struck me though was like all the ads. It's just cop show after cop show after cop show, and it's just like, this is all just propaganda. Where are the shows about like how brutal police are, how corrupt they are, how indifferent they are, how that they kill people, that they actually do a really shitty job at solving crimes, that they a huge portion of murders go unsolved, only a tiny portion of rapes are ever solved. Like, if I've had like bikes stolen twice in New York, they don't give a shit.
Yeah.
You call and I would call them up because I had to get a police report to try and get some insurance money back. And I had one bike stolen from a neighborhood in Queens where everyone is just like, oh yeah, bike theft is really bad here. It's a real problem here. And I called the detective and he's like, oh yeah, we don't have a problem with bike theft. I'm like, because no one reports it to you because you don't do anything about it. and then he just felt silent. Probably went back to stuffing his face with donuts. So we don't see this. I mean, just the ideology, like, we are still not confronting what is going on in this society. It's still, we're looking at it through a narrow lens. Now, the aperture is opened a little bit more. We're letting in a little bit more light, but the media are like patting themselves on the back. And it's just like, first of all, where the hell were you? It's just like, we on the left have been saying this for decades and decades. The African American community, there are all these scholars, the Chicano community, the Native American community who've been like studying this stuff for decades and decades. And it's just like, and you're still not really looking at what's going on and putting it all together. That this country was founded in the crucible of native genocide and African chattel slavery, and what that means for the character and content, and how it has never been confronted head on, and there's still, I think, a deep refusal to do that, because it would mean we would be looking at a very different country. Now, we'd be looking at a country that is potentially just, that is potentially, liberatory. I would argue it would very much have to be socialist, that you cannot have racial justice in a capitalist society. That is absolutely impossible. And so there is an unwillingness to address any of this still.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, of course.
To keep forcing these issues.
Yeah.
To ensure people can't look away.
I would just like to state that before we get to the last segment here that I would like to feature, that what Arun points to in that segment that really encapsulates a lot of what I think about when I think about this country. It's really hard for me to look away from all the things that Arun pointed to in that segment. The fact that this country was built on the bodies of countless people that have been genocided, that have been enslaved, and that we still live within the very structures, the very institutions, the very culture that gave birth to that. That hasn't gone away. That no amount of reform, legislation, or any of that is going to change that fact. I really wanted to end this very long part of this very long episode with award-winning writer, poet, and scholar Frank B. Wilderson III. He is the author of the book Afro-Pessimism, which has been described as a seminal work on the philosophy of blackness, that through a combination of profound personal reflection and metacritical theory peers deeply into the heart of the black experience in the world today. To quote from the description of the book, "Why does the perpetual cycle of slavery in all its political, intellectual, and cultural forms continue to define the black experience? And why is anti-black violence such a predominant feature not only in the United States but around the world?" Wilderson presents the tenets of an increasingly prominent intellectual movement that sees blackness through the lens of perpetual slavery. Drawing on works of philosophy, literature, film, and critical theory, he shows that the social construct of slavery, as seen through pervasive anti-black subjugation and violence, is hardly a relic of the past, but the very engine that powers our civilization, and that without this master-slave dynamic, the calculus bolstering world civilization would collapse. This interview just needed to be presented here at the very end. I think that by presenting this philosophy, this metacritical theory of Afro-pessimism, it explains a lot. It really explains what we have witnessed over the past year, what we have been a part of for the past 400 to 500 years on this continent, and longer than that, actually. It even goes deeper than that, as Frank talks about in the fuller interview. I think putting this here made the most sense to me, to put this at the very end of this part on the uprisings. In a way, it doesn't really resolve anything. It doesn't provide a solution to this, per se. And also, it may contradict some of the views of the people that I featured in this part 4. And I'm willing to live in the contradictions of this. I'm willing to live in this space of paradox, to not really know entirely what to make of all of this. I think that's just the way it is. We live in a very complex, confusing, and very often mysterious world with all of its horrors, its beauties, its irresolvable problems. And I read Afro-Pessimism. I had interviewed Frank. I had read some of it before I interviewed him. I really liked this discussion with him a lot. I really, really enjoyed it a great deal and learned a great deal from just talking with him. And then I finished Afro-Pessimism, and I cannot recommend the book enough. It's like one of those books where, you have this framework of looking at reality, you have a framework of looking at race and the history of race, and I still have that framework to a great degree. But Afro-Pessimism was able to shift it in such a degree that it didn't depress me necessarily, but it definitely put me in this place of like, wow, this is a lot more than I had ever even considered. It's much more, I don't want to say irresolvable, but there is a sense of like, if we're going to truly address the issues that were raised during these uprisings, we're going to have to do a lot more than just reform the police. We're going to have to do a lot more than even just abolishing the police. This is going to be a multi-generational process that needs to begin now. You know, something that really stands out is, you know, you highlight the Black suffering is not analogous or comparable to other oppressed groups of people, whether we're talking about through a Marxist lens of the working class, or we're looking at it through, you know, maybe a radical feminist perspective, or other minority groups that are oppressed in, say, the United States or in many other parts of the world, that there is a difference between the Black experience and others. And I'm curious how that tracks or that is received. I know you kind of went over that a little bit, but especially now in the wake of, I mean, this last year, 2020, was obviously very explosive for several reasons, but one of them being the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which I know that you're from. And I recently read an interview in which you, or maybe an article, but it was an interview where you said that you grew up in that area. You know that street where the police precinct was burned down. You are very, like, you know that place. And just the wave of uprisings and protests for months in 2020. And I'm curious how this Afro-pessimist framework fits into a broader social justice movement, or whether it fits in at all. I mean, how do you see that?
Well, that's the $64,000 question.
Yeah.
Believe me, if you hold a conference on that question, you're going to need metal detectors at the door, okay?
All right.
Because, you know, everyone coming to that conference would not be able to agree on lunch. So I just one little geographical point. That police in around 72, I used to. That's a street called Lake Street where the cop station was burned down, and it's a wide boulevard running all the way to the west to the western edge, which is where the beautiful lakes are, which is a place called Kenwood, where I grew up, and then to the eastern part, which is working class and Native American and Black. So I didn't actually grow up in that spot. I grew up 20 blocks west of there in the lake area. But it was a place in the 1970s where all kinds of kids after hours parties would drag race up and down and kind of, I guess we were, you know, in a way playing game once, you know, because you're drag racing past a place where there are lots of police, and so you're inviting them to chase you. And I had a number of escapades. So that's what I said of that interview. That I actually know that spot because that's where we used to drag race in our parents' cars. Sorry, Patrick. What was it?
Oh, I was just asking about. You know, I was really just saying in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that emerged in the U.S., how Afro-pessimism as a framework can fits or does not fit within this sort of social justice framework that we tend to operate within when we talk about systemic oppression and racism and so on.
Well, I think Afro-pessimism has interested people, non-Black people like yourself, and I mean non-Black people on the left who are organizers and doing, and I call this kind of podcast a form of organizing, even if you're not out in the streets of Idaho facing the Fed. You know, it's all left-wing organizing. Interested people like yourself on the left, but it's also agitated, I think, more people as a form of exceptionalism and oppression Olympics. That's on one side. On the other side, with Black people, I think it has become a very large ear trumpet, and has it's not like a new discovery. like E equals MC squared by Einstein. It's radical Black intellectuals making the statement that grassroots organizing, which is multiracial and class-based, suffers from an insufficiently comparative analysis of the people in the coalition. Grassroots organizers suffers from an insufficiently comparable analysis of the people in the coalition. And here's why. And so that's one thing it does, because it says, look, the same rope might hang a Mexican in Arizona as a lynching, and that same rope could hang a Black person in Mississippi as a lynching. The same bullet could kill a Black person in Compton with a wanton police action that kills a Latinx person in East LA. But if you get stuck there, you're stuck in a report on the performance of violence, and you've inhibited yourself from thinking about violence as a structuring paradigm, as something that creates a world of limitations and possibilities. So we borrow this from Orlando Patterson's book Slavery and Social Death, in which he said, look, up until this point, which is 1982 when Harvard published this book, all the people writing about slavery have been writing like, I am defining what slavery is. And Orlando Patterson is basically saying that no, what they've been doing is giving us reportage. It's like in third grade, if your teacher said, define something, and you said, well, it's like when me and Johnny went so-and-so, no, stop. You're giving me a report of the event. That's not a description. And so we're not trained, and I know this from over 20 years of meeting freshmen coming into college, and even meeting graduate students. We're not trained to think at high levels of abstraction, as people are, say, in Germany, France, and various parts of South America, which is precisely why behavioral psychology and late Freud, meaning the Freud of superego, ego, and id, are so prominent in the continental United States and Canada and Britain, and why the work of Lacan is not very prominent, but you find that the work of Lacan is very prominent in South America, parts of Africa, and Europe. It's precisely because everything, and I'm speaking, with a kind of sweeping shorthand, but most things that Anglo-Americans do, they understand through example, not through a more amorphous form of relationality. And so what Patterson has argued is that, look, it takes an ocean of violence to create a new structure of relations. You can't do it through negotiation. You could not go, 350 years ago. You could not go to the pastoral people in the countryside of England and say, listen, why don't you help us chop up the land with these enclosure acts, make it more stringent for you to be penalized for killing the king's deer or farming where you want to. Help us build roads, an artery of a network of roads that lead into London, so that these roads can become sluice gates through which you lose your pastoral identity and go into the cities, and your bodies are reshaped into different temporalities and different spaces and industrial workplaces. And you're going to suffer for a while, but it's going to be really groovy by the time we get to the 20th century. Can we do that, people? No, right?
Right.
You've got to kill a bunch of people. You've got to do violence to the cartography of the land. There has to be an ocean of violence to move from what we call positions, the position of the serf, into the position of the worker. Now, Patterson then makes the next point. Once you have 100 years or so of people's bodies, their relations to time, their morning anxieties being completely recalibrated to accommodate the capitalist demand, then the violence that you needed to produce that paradigm must go into remission. It must go under the table, and it should only rear its ugly head when there are transgressions, what we in Afro-pessimism call contingent violence. And these transgressions could be minor, from people. I always tell students, when you leave a job, make sure you break something. Pour molasses in the Xerox machine, or steal something. But don't leave a corporation the way you found it.
Right.
So that's a transgression. Another transgression could be organizing a labor union. Another transgression could be a national strike. Another transgression could be the Cuban Revolution. But the paradigm returns to its original sin of violence based upon the reaction of the working class when they revolt, minor or not so minor. And and this is also the paradigm of patriarchy. And Patterson is saying, look, once you do violence to people to change positions and create new positions and new paradigms, you want stability in that paradigm. So the stability must come through hegemony, not through violence. And it's only when the people revolt, or it's only when the working class or women begin to produce a counter hegemony that you resort to the violence again. Beatty said, aha, the slave paradigm is different, because the kind of violence that produced the slave must be repeated ritualistically over centuries in order for that paradigm to be stabilized. So Black people are not invited to spontaneously give their consent. It doesn't even matter. That's why, it doesn't matter if a black person is actually head of the Proud Boys. Right. Sounds ironic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there are also tons of Black police chiefs, and they're Black Republicans, and they're Black Make America Great people. That is not essential, because Black consent to hegemony is never at issue. The violence against Black bodies doesn't go into remission when Black people agree to the terms of their subjugation. And that is the thing that organizing spaces, to come full circle to your question, have not been able to get their heads around. That you've got an Asian person, a Black person, a woman, a working class white person, all in the same room struggling for something like a referendum. And yet the way in which the violence of but they're living in different paradigms, even though they're in the same room, breathing the same air. And this is the contribution of Afro-pessimism.
Okay. Why do you think it is that, I think you described it, what did you say, oppression Olympics? I can't remember what you said exactly. I think that was it. But why is there this, I guess I see this as, why does there have to be this almost competition on who is more oppressed, or what is more, you know what I mean? Like, I feel like what you're saying is just reality. It is what it is. This isn't about placing people on a particular pedestal, or saying that, I don't feel like there has to be this competitive nature to it. Why is it within, I say social justice circles, but, whatever you want to call it, why is there this sense of needing for all these oppressed groups of people to be on, like, oh, we're all oppressed equally. We might be oppressed differently, but we're all kind of the same, and we have to find a way of building solidarity or coalitions among us by just not acknowledging exactly what you just said there, basically. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, I think that's let me speak specifically about the United States, because it becomes a little more complex when I broaden out globally, although the same means of approach would be for both cases. Ultimately, the American activist who is not Black, and I've been in activist really radical activist spaces since the time I was 12 years old, because my parents were, I was a university brat.
Mm-hmm.
And, a university brat during the Tet Offensive got exposed to a lot of things that other kids did not get exposed to. And one of the things that I began to understand in kind of looking back over my life and where I've been is that non-Black Americans are really not against the country in their collective unconscious, even if they say they are. And this is not like I'm saying these people are lying. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying something, in fact, a little more serious than that, which is to say that whether the white leftists, and there are exceptions, but I'm speaking generally speaking, because you're asking about organizing spaces.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, what I found at the level of affect is that white activists and in the western part of the country, Latinx activists, and this is a little bit different when you deal with Puerto Ricans in New York, which I can talk about later. White activists and Chicano Latinx activists and Asian activists really would not get any joy of seeing this country burn to the ground.
Mm.
That would not be pleasurable. And that kind of iconoclastic dream of fire is very pleasurable to a kind of collective Black psyche. And I'm speaking shorthand. I know that everyone's not like that, but when you look at the logic of in the 1800s, the logic of Native American violent resistance, the so-called Indian Wars that ended in 1870. And you look at the logic of slave revolts, whether it's Nat Turner or the work of Harriet Tubman or Denmark Vesey, what you see is a very different kind of structure of feeling. What do I mean by that? I mean that the Native American revolt, which is just as violent in its response to settler domination as and sometimes more violent, than the Black American slave revolt to plantation domination, that is a revolt coming from a place of loss, wanting to regain something. It's highly conceptually coherent. You stole our land. You sent our kids to these Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, and you took them away from us. You did this, you did that. You're destroying our culture. Yet the slave revolt actually is not motivated, at least in the collective unconscious, by a kind of origin of plenitude, a sense of here is the thing we have lost. We're dealing with people who have a priori been destroyed as a people. And so where did that, if they were destroyed as a people, where then did the capacity for personhood go? If the Indians' land was destroyed as their capacity for organizing resource, what they call source, not resources, along their cosmological and agricultural sensibilities, that went into a reorganization of land and the word resources then comes into being based upon Western European ideas of economy, division, cartography. So you can see very coherently, Ohlone land is now a place called San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to launch it. Mendocino was, I forgot the original people there. You get the point. Right? Mm-hmm. We're talking not about loss with Black suffering. We're talking about absence. And so the absence of the capacity to even know what was lost, which is to say, not even if people who know they're from Africa. The point is that the world looks at you not as a cultural being, but as Frantz Fanon says, a negrophobogenic stimulus to anxiety, which is to say that the Indians' ideas stimulate the anxiety of the settler. They could change the world and make it into the world that it was, the native world. The Black idea doesn't exist for the other. In other words, no one actually talks about Black demands in a coherent way, because in the collective unconscious, Black people exist as extensions of everyone else's propertied being. And so the slave revolt was actually often about destruction of this world, not regaining the world that I had. And that kind of dynamic embodies every Black person, even if they run the Republican Party. It embodies every Black person, and that produces a kind of instant phobogenic response whenever a Black person walks in the room, because here is someone for whom, if we were to redress their suffering, we'd never get to the end of it.
So the question that came up while I was listening to you, and just before this interview began, is, I mean, you say this in your book as well, that really, I guess you said this earlier, just that other oppressed groups would not take much pleasure in seeing this country burn to the ground, while Black people may have that feeling. I guess that's a part of the experience. And I guess my question really, I guess, comes down to this: is there ever going to be a point in the future where Afro-pessimism will not accurately describe the Black experience? And if so, how would that occur in your understanding?
Well, the answer to that question is seditious, so I'll pass.
Oh, you're not going to answer it. Okay, well.
I mean, I'm kind of fun in the old coach, but if I were to actually say, let me put it diagnostically.
Okay.
Because I'm kind of tongue in cheek here. I mean, if I were to answer you tactically, yes, that would be a crime, right?
Sure. Right. Yeah, if there's a way of using a kind of innuendo or something to allude to what you really feel. Yeah.
Look, here's the deal. There can be no world without Black people. And my symptomatic memory or rearticulation of the Arab dynamic. What am I trying to say there? I'm trying to say world is being made from 625 AD all the way up for the next 1,000 years, right? World is being made, the world of the Arab family, okay? And so there can be no world without anti-Blackness. And there can be no Blacks in the world. My description of the harem should anecdotally explain what I mean by that. There can be no world without anti-Blackness, and there can be no Blacks in the world, okay? So the destruction of Black femininity, or it's not even Black at that point, it's African femininity, so that because the mind is always aggressive against any form of constraints. And yet if you don't have constraints, you can't have community. And so how do you find a grounding wire for the constraints that are not acceptable to your coherence and stability of your community? Well, the grounding wire and I don't like this word primitive, but I'm doing a quotation, in so-called primitive societies, the grounding wire were burning things in effigy, dance rituals with mass and that kind of thing, so that you expel your transgressing desires onto rituals of performance. Well, the grounding wire for the past 1,300 years has been those same kind of rituals danced around the fire, but instead they're the lynching and the destruction of Black bodies, okay? Mm-hmm. So I think that there cannot be a world as we know it with Black people who are free. And when this world as we know it ends, there will be sentient beings like you and I on the other side, but they will not be Black and they will not be human. there'll be another category, set of categories. And that's not going to come about through negotiation or consciousness raising.
Right. There isn't any kind of legislation that Congress could pass to bring that about, right?
Very seriously. I like to pass a bill to end the United States and everything around it. All those in favor, raise your hand. Yeah, you know.
Well, I'm not going to comment too much on what Frank had to say there. I'm just going to leave his words there. That is what needed to be said at the end of this very long part of episode 300. I just really want to thank you all so much for going on this journey with me up to this point, for getting through this part on the uprisings last year in 2020. As I mentioned before in previous parts, we will be moving on to the next section, which will be dealing with fascism in the United States and what ultimately led up to January 6th. We did touch on some of that in this part. I think that this part and the part previous to this was a really good setup for what we're going to explore in part 5. I'm going to give you my little spiel that I normally do here at the end of these things. If you want to learn more about this series, you want to listen to the previous parts, if you want to learn more about my podcast in general, you can go to my website, lastborninthewilderness.com. Everything you need to know will be there, including all of the timestamps and all the sources for each of these interviews. If you would like to support this podcast monetarily, there are a few ways to do that. The first is through a one-time donation. You can do that through PayPal. Go to paypal.me/lastbornpodcast, or you can donate through Venmo at lastbornpodcast. If you would like to sustain this work on a monthly or yearly basis, you can do that through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/lastborninthewilderness. If you contribute, you will gain early access to these episodes before I release them publicly and gain access to some other exclusive content as well. Thank you to the patrons for your monetary support. Thank you to everybody that listens and subscribes to this work. Have a good one and take care.